Chapter 301, Reunion. A cheerful and familiar girlish voice came from outside the door, and Saul's eyes widened in surprise. He dismissed the devil vine by the entrance and released his mental power. Outside the door stood a man and a woman, and neither of them resisted Saul's mental scan. With that confirmation, Saul immediately opened the gates of Black Castle. Standing at the doorway was Kelly, her face expressionless and still faintly reflecting light from the metal shimmer on her skin. The other person frowned slightly, as if pondering what exactly Old Buddy was supposed to mean. Kelly, Senior Byron. Saul hadn't expected to see them, both outside the tower at the same time. How are you two showing up here together? Saul looked at Byron first. Could it be that you're here to take over Black Castle, Senior? It's me. Kelly waved her hand in front of Saul's face. Senior Byron just happened to be looking for you too, so we traveled together. Byron didn't speak, merely nodded along. Saul was a bit surprised. He stepped aside to let his two travel-worn friends come in and rest. The three of them walked side by side through Black Castle. Saul turned to Kelly and asked, "Aren't you still just second rank? How can you take over Black Castle?" "Aren't you second rank too?" Kelly rolled her eyes, but it was more out of habit than irritation. "I'm not planning to run all over the place. I'll just be staying here to study and conduct experiments and pass messages between the Kemaduchi and the Wizard Tower when needed." Saul stopped walking and frowned, clearly expressing his concern. Black Castle isn't safe. It'd be better if a third-rank apprentice were stationed here. Kelly wrinkled her nose and also came to a halt. "I know. That's why, aside from passing messages, I won't be leaving the castle. Plus, my mentor gave me a powerful magical artifact. If anyone tries to invade, it can protect me until help arrives from the Wizard Tower. Besides, I had a reason for applying for this post specifically." Walking silently at the back, Senior Byron seemed deep in thought. When Saul and Kelly stopped, he kept walking and ended up bumping into Saul's turned shoulder. That sudden contact interrupted their conversation. Because in that instant of physical contact with Byron, Saul felt a ripple pass through his own gray-white skin. Though his clothes concealed it, he could feel a tiny tear open up in his skin. It wasn't painful, but there was something squirming inside the wound. Without a word, Saul calmed his body, allowing the wound to heal on its own. He maintained a confused expression as he turned to look at Byron. All of this had happened in the space of a fleeting moment, like a passing thought. Only then did Kelly notice something had happened, and she turned around. "Instead of worrying about whether I'll be okay in Black Castle, you should probably ask how Senior Byron is doing. I think his situation is a little more urgent." Saul now gave Byron a serious look, and the senior stood there quietly, letting Saul observe him. "Senior, is it the same issue from last time?" Byron hesitated, then nodded, but still didn't open his mouth to speak. That's when Saul realized, ever since meeting Byron again, the mouth on his neck hadn't opened at all. He'd only been using gestures or muffled hums to communicate. Could it be that things had gotten so bad he couldn't even speak anymore? Saul immediately said, "Senior, please wait for me in the third-floor lab. I'll come find you as soon as I finish handing over with Kelly." Byron nodded. He had spent a lot of time near Hanging Hands Valley by Border Falls City over the past few years, and was even more familiar with Black Castle than Saul. At the staircase in the main hall, the trio went their separate ways, one going up, the other two heading down. Saul led Kelly through the basement, past the wine cellar, and into the underground cave, finally arriving at the massive central root of the Devil Vine. This is the Devil Vine. When I was hastily assigned here, I only knew that by injecting my mental power into the main root, I could become the temporary master. But you're taking over the job officially, so you probably know more than I did. Of course, Kelly nodded proudly. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing two pale arms that rarely saw sunlight. Her skin was flawless, and it shimmered faintly with a golden luster, like a girl who had dusted herself with fine gold powder. Saul stared at her arms. "Do they look good? Your metal toxins still haven't been resolved." "I kept them on purpose," Kelly said as she pulled a blue vial from her pocket. "It's for my next research project." She uncorked the vial and tossed back the contents in one gulp. Immediately afterward, she bent over and clutched her mouth, eyes welling with tears as if she'd swallowed a tube of wasabi. A few seconds later, she blinked the tears away and, breathing hard through her teeth, said to Saul, "What you mentioned last time about radioactive metals gave me some inspiration. I'm trying to develop a special metal toxin, but it's hard to control and could affect people nearby. So my mentor suggested I find a sealed, uninhabited space to continue my research. If anything goes wrong, I can contact him directly." "So you thought of Black Castle," Saul remarked. "Do you know how to contact the Wizard Tower from here?" "Of course I do. I made sure to be fully prepared before coming." Kelly raised her eyebrows smugly. "Only the official master of Black Castle can reach the Wizard Tower. A temporary master can't. So don't worry, I won't end up in a crisis with no way to call for help." "I see," Saul nodded in realization. So that's why Barry and the others had assumed he couldn't request reinforcements from the Wizard Tower. Kelly let out a long breath and raised both hands, approaching the devil vine as if she were about to strangle it. "Hello, looks like you're going to be my new master." The devil vine sounded unusually cheerful. But Kelly didn't respond. She simply continued advancing slowly. "You seem a little nervous," Saul said with a bit of confusion. She clearly knew the process of becoming Black Castle's master, but she looked way more serious than Saul had been. Kelly stared fixedly at the devil vine. "Don't talk to me. My mentor told me that forming a spiritual connection with the devil vine is extremely difficult, and that I should be ready to fail on the first try. I really don't want to drink another mental potion." Even though she told Saul to keep quiet, she just kept talking to herself. Saul held back a laugh. "You're definitely nervous, but is it really that hard to bond with the devil vine?" He gave the vine a sidelong glance. A few of its tiny aerial roots twitched for no reason. At last, Kelly reached the vine and grabbed it with both hands. Her neatly trimmed nails dug into the root's surface, leaving little crescent-shaped marks. Her facial muscles tensed up, mind and body straining together. After a minute passed, she suddenly opened her eyes, lips slightly parted in surprise. "I did it," she pouted. "That wasn't so hard." She turned to look at Saul. "Did you do something?" Saul spread his hands innocently. "You were forming a bond. What could I possibly have done?" Kelly narrowed her eyes. "HMPH, the way you said that makes it even less believable." Chapter 302, Absorbing the Wraith. The hardest part about becoming the master of Black Castle was establishing a mental connection with the devil vine. Only by forming that connection could one truly take control of the entire Black Castle and Black Castle Forset, both for offense and defense. That was why the devil vine was the true core of the entire Black Castle, built far away from the Wizard Tower. After Kelly completed this step, she no longer needed Saul's guidance. Saul didn't even understand it as well as she did. So Saul left Kelly alone underground. After politely and deliberately bidding farewell to the devil vine, he went alone to the laboratory on the 3rd floor. Senior Byron was already waiting there. When Saul arrived at the doorway, he saw the lab door was open. The senior stood quietly inside, still breathing, yet looking like a corpse. Even closer to death than the disobedient corpses in the 2nd storeroom. Becoming a true wizard seemed even more dangerous than Saul had imagined. "Senior, are you all right?" Upon hearing Saul's voice, Byron slowly twisted his head. The skin on his neck stretched and compressed, forming deep, heavy folds. It looked more like clothing than flesh. Byron didn't speak, but Saul could already guess why he and Kelly had come looking for him. Saul closed the door behind him. From the corners of the room, thick dark green vines grew rapidly, sealing the doorway and creeping up the walls, turning the space into a green prison. Byron's neck rotated along with the devil vine, then snapped back to face forward, looking at Saul in confusion. He couldn't speak now, but his eyes conveyed his meaning clearly enough. Kelly has already connected with the devil vine. Saul rubbed his nose. It's just that my relationship with it is a bit better, so sometimes it's willing to help me out. Byron stared at Saul for a few seconds, then silently nodded. Byron, fine then. Byron had once tried to buy Saul's method of absorbing wraiths, but even if Saul had taught it to him, Byron wouldn't have been able to use it. So Saul had promised instead to help him absorb the wraith inside his body. Now that Byron had rushed over with Kelly instead of waiting at the wizard tower, Saul knew the senior must have already hit his limit. The out-of-control wraith needed to be absorbed as soon as possible. That's why, after confirming that Kelly could bond with the devil vine, he'd left her behind and rushed over to check Byron's condition. Seeing that the other man couldn't even speak, Saul knew it had to be done immediately. This was his first time absorbing a wraith for someone else. He had to be extra cautious. So Saul instructed the devil vine to seal the entire room to prevent anyone from entering, partly to stop Kelly from bursting in and disrupting his progress, and partly to protect her from any side effects. Once the devil vine had obediently sealed the chamber, Saul stepped forward and carefully examined the wraith inside Byron. "Senior, can you loosen the wraith in your body a bit? I need to confirm where to begin." Byron hesitated for a moment, then quickly nodded. He took off his outer robe and the linen tunic underneath, revealing a body that was slightly swollen. Immediately after, his torso suddenly swelled to nearly double its size, vaguely resembling those human balloon figures they'd seen in Hanging Hands Valley. But this time, unlike before, Byron's bulging body didn't swell into a smooth sphere. Instead, it looked more like a cratered meteorite. Saul noticed that every now and then, a terrifying human face would appear on the surface of Byron's skin. Sunken eyes and mouth, protruding nose bridge and cheekbones. Each face bore a twisted, savage expression. They were desperately trying to break free, trying to shatter the control Byron had over them. The senior's face was twisted with strain as well. Clearly, maintaining this state was already exhausting for him. Saul narrowed his eyes and swiftly scanned Byron's entire body. Suddenly, he flicked his wrists. The skin at his fingertips blended and warped, gradually elongating, his arms transforming into two thick, octopus-like tentacles. Byron, who had been closely watching Saul's every move, was stunned. His eyes widened in shock. His eyeballs trembled, as if they might fall out of their sockets at any moment. "Senior, don't move," Saul warned, then thrust his arms forward. The two tentacles shot toward Byron's throat and heart. Both of these were fatal points on the human body. By instinct, Byron tried to dodge Saul's strike, but remembering Saul's earlier words, he forcibly suppressed his body's reflexes and stood still. The next second, the two tentacles pierced Byron's skin. But to Byron's surprise, he felt no pain. In fact, he didn't feel anything at all. Those two pale gray tentacles felt more like illusions, simply overlapping with his body. Before he could figure out what was happening, a terrifying suction force pierced through his soul. As a practitioner of dark element magic himself, Byron was no stranger to soul-based attacks. But he had never seen an apprentice capable of such a terrifying soul-level technique. What frightened him even more was the realization that he couldn't resist this overwhelming suction force. Driven by survival instinct, Byron immediately circulated his mental energy, trying his hardest to suppress the soul disturbance, working to bind his soul more tightly to his body. Like a cat clawing desperately at a couch with all its paws. Saul glanced up at Byron, but didn't stop him from circulating his mental force. In fact, Saul was already quite satisfied that Byron had refrained from launching a counterattack with magic. Since this was his first time absorbing a wraith for someone else, everything had to be figured out as he went. Saul found that Byron's attempt to stabilize his own mental force was helpful. It was like peeling off a bandage that had stuck to skin all day. Saul had told Byron not to move so he could pull forcefully. And Byron's instinctive effort to stabilize his soul was like strengthening the skin beneath the bandage. That was absolutely necessary, otherwise, when Saul pulled off the bandage, he might peel off a layer of Byron's skin as well. Finally, through the joint efforts of Saul and Byron, the wraith hidden in Byron's body was completely absorbed by Saul's tentacles. In Saul's mind, it was as if he heard a loud rip. Mission complete. Saul withdrew his tentacles, and no wounds appeared on Byron's body. Watching the senior's expression gradually calm, Saul smiled and asked, "Senior, how are you feeling now?" Byron closed his eyes and quietly sensed the changes in his body. After a while, a crack opened in his throat. "Very good. I haven't felt this well in a long time." Saul let out a breath of relief. He had been worried that absorbing the wraith might cause Byron other problems. However, during the process, Saul's tentacles seemed to have uncovered one of the senior's secrets. "Senior, your body, don't tell me your locator." Byron opened his eyes and nodded without hesitation. Saul looked him in the eye and said seriously, "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone about this." For wizard apprentices who hadn't yet become true wizards, the locator was their fatal weakness. An absolute secret. But just now, while absorbing the wraith, Saul had inevitably sensed the presence of Byron's locator. That was probably why Byron had chosen to seek Saul's help in the first place. Byron wasn't surprised by Saul's promise. He nodded calmly. Chapter 303, The Hardship of Advancement. When Saul and the now-recovered Byron left the laboratory, Kelly had already completed a series of preparations and was leisurely seated in the front hall, flipping through a book left on the table by the former owner, Machi Machi. Hearing movement, she looked up from the pages just in time to see the two descending the stairs, one after the other. Especially Saul, he was even carrying a backpack. "You're leaving already?" She casually tossed the book onto the couch. "Yes, I haven't returned to the warehouse in a long time. I originally thought I'd be gone for just 10 days or so, but I ended up staying an extra half-month. I need to hurry back and hand over my work." Saul was fully aware that once he and Byron left, Kelly would be alone in the Black Castle. While it was true she had voluntarily come here to study her magic, and her personality wasn't one to mind solitude, the Black Castle was ultimately not as convenient as the Wizard Tower. "Sorry, we finally get to meet again, and now I'm leaving in a rush," Saul said. It had been a long time since he and Kelly had studied or researched together. It seemed that, after advancing to second-rank apprentices, the two of them had begun walking different paths. Kelly, on the other hand, seemed much more carefree. She shrugged and said, "No worries. If there ever comes a day when we're always sitting around chatting with nothing better to do, that probably means death isn't far away." She added, "I've left a communication track at the registry and with Mentor Guido. It lets you contact me directly at the Black Castle. If you need anything, just go to either of those places. Oh, right, be sure to bring plenty of magic crystals. The communication track eats up a lot of magic." "Then let's stick to letters," Saul declined with a smile. Kelly rolled her eyes, sat back down on the couch, found the book she just tossed aside and resumed reading. Saul said his farewell. Then Byron and I will be off. Kelly didn't look up, only lazily waved a hand in farewell. But then Byron suddenly spoke. Actually, you don't have to keep calling me senior. If I'm not mistaken, you've already reached third rank, haven't you? Saul hadn't expected Byron to notice, but he didn't deny it. Yes. Over the past half-month, Saul had successfully mastered the second-rank spell Touch of Torment. He was now officially a third-rank wizard apprentice. Thud! Kelly's book slipped from her hand and smacked hard onto the floor. You're third rank already, she stood up in disbelief. How long has it been since you reached second rank? Has it even been 3 months? Saul thought seriously for a moment. Nearly half a year. You even had to think about it. Kelly clenched her fists, teeth grinding. Then she suddenly straightened her back, her expression resolute. Next time we meet, I'll have caught up to you. Her eyes burned with intensity. She didn't think for a second she was exaggerating. Saul, too, shed his smile and nodded solemnly. I believe you. The two of them had absolute faith that Kelly would advance to third rank. Only Byron, standing off to the side, felt as if he'd just been stabbed in the chest. He looked at his own age compared to these two youths, and his expression slumped. Before long, Saul and Byron boarded the carriage that would take them back. This 2-horse carriage was far larger than the one Saul had ridden alone. Who had paid for the upgrade was anyone's guess. The black castle behind them was already hidden beneath the shade of the trees by the time Saul looked back through the window. It wasn't that he was overcome with emotion and reluctant to leave. Rather, he'd secretly left something behind. When Saul turned his head, little Algie also quietly poked out from the window, imitating its master and observing the fragments it had left behind in the black castle. Although Kelly wasn't as likely as Saul to attract trouble, and even had a magical artifact personally prepared by her mentor for self-defense, Saul still couldn't fully trust the outwardly cordial relationship between Borderfall City and the Black Castle. He didn't feel comfortable leaving her here alone. So he instructed little Algie to leave behind some clones, and in critical moments, it was allowed to steal nourishment from the Devil Vine to protect Kelly. Little Algie originated from the soul-devouring mire and was originally a magical creature on the same level as the Devil Vine. But ever since following Saul, its strength had steadily increased thanks to the influence of the diary. Now, when it encountered the Devil Vine, it could easily suppress it, and had even nearly seized the Devil Vine's territory. It wouldn't be long before the Devil Vine realized there were clones of little Algie hidden in the forest surrounding the Black Castle. Hopefully, it wouldn't cry too loudly when it did. You two really make me jealous, Byron sighed from across the carriage, finally speaking after Saul straightened up. Saul had still been thinking about the Black Castle and Borderfall City and didn't quite catch his meaning at first. For you and Kelly, advancing to third rank is just a matter of time. But me, if I hadn't gotten your plastic bone formula, I might have already left the Wizard Tower, wandering alone and aimlessly chasing the next advancement. Saul smiled, but you figured it out with your own intelligence. My formula wasn't a real solution, it just provided a direction. A single spark of enlightenment is incredibly rare, Byron replied, his voice full of emotion. Now that he'd resolved the issue of the wraith within him, Byron seemed to have opened up. His words flowed freely. Even a powerful Wizard Tower struggles to cultivate a single third-rank apprentice. Even someone as gifted as Kongsha is still wandering out there, trying to find a way to advance. At this point, Byron suddenly seemed to recall something, and his expression darkened slightly. Oh right, Nick is dead. Saul froze, Senior Nick. He'd noticed something was off with Nick the last time they met. Remembering how Nick had helped him in Hanging Hand Valley, Saul had asked after his condition. Unfortunately, Nick hadn't shared anything, nor had he sought Saul out afterward. And Nick specialized in the light element. Even if Saul had known the trouble he was in, he probably wouldn't have been able to help. How did he die? Accident? Murder? Saul asked urgently, remembering Nick's connection to the grinding sound fruit. Neither. He failed to advance and succumbed to contamination. Failed to advance, Saul murmured, so it really can kill you. He recalled the last time he saw Nick. Nick specialized in light, but the spells he studied all had to do with emotion. Saul had never asked why emotion was considered part of the light element. He had always believed that dark magic was more dangerous. After all, it dealt with death and wraiths, and the knowledge it required was often bizarre and chaotic. But now it seemed that light might only sound pleasant. Byron explained that although Nick's focus was emotion, he had to constantly repress his own feelings. Every time he was wounded or his mental body fluctuated, the fear, sorrow, or even joy he'd suppressed would rebound like a tidal wave. If he couldn't withstand the backlash, his mind would collapse. That was why Nick so often relied on grinding sound fruit to help him endure the most intense surges of emotion. Everything you described matches the state he was in, Saul admitted. The news of Nick's death left him feeling heavy. But the way he looked in the end, he didn't seem like he'd simply been contaminated. He remembered Nick being tense but still rational. He'd even given Saul his last grinding sound fruits. Saul frowned. The apprentice who had once applied for large amounts of grinding sound fruit had died. Grind Sale Town had been wiped out entirely, and now even Nick, the one who knew the fruit best, was gone. The mood in the carriage grew grim. Now all those connected to the grinding sound fruits were almost completely wiped out. Chapter 304, Not Too Secure. Almost all the apprentices connected to the grinding sound fruit were now dead. There's still me, Saul thought silently, etching this fact into his heart. Even now, he didn't think the grinding sound fruit was all that rare. But he had to admit, in certain situations, the fruit really did help stabilize one's emotions for a short time. And as someone who had experienced it firsthand, Saul fully understood why the Wizard Tower placed such importance on the grinding sound fruit. It could provide protection, but it wasn't a strategic resource, which made all the conspiracies and schemes surrounding the fruit and Grind Sale Town feel abrupt. I was just inadvertently drawn into Grind Sale Town, only to witness its downfall and destruction. No, that's not right. Saul's face gradually darkened. It wasn't by accident. It was Nick who led me to Grind Sale Town in the first place. Just like Senior Byron said, he really did leave halfway on purpose. Saul lifted his head and looked towards Senior Byron, who had also fallen into silence. Senior, did Nick really die from a failed advancement? Did anyone actually see his body, or was it just something someone said? Seeing Saul's expression turn serious, Byron also straightened slightly and opened the mouth in his throat. He did fail the advancement. He was severely contaminated. Mentor has personally dissected his corpse. Is that so? And did the Tower Master ever take any interest in it? Byron hadn't expected Saul to bring up the Tower Master, and a flicker of fear passed through his eyes. No, in the end, it was Mentor Rum who took Nick's remains away. There was too much contamination, nothing usable, and it couldn't be buried properly either. Mentor Rum, Saul murmured. He'd only planned to sneak into Grind Sale Town, grab a bit of grinding sound fruit, and get out. He hadn't expected things to spiral into such chaos. Now, probably everyone knows he had gone to Grind Sale Town. When he returned to the tower, he'd likely draw even more attention. He couldn't help wondering, was anyone secretly waiting for his return? Senior, did anyone else know you and Kelly came out to replace me? Byron replied solemnly, we didn't go out of our way to make it known, but it wasn't exactly a secret either. Saul leaned back against the soft cushion of the carriage seat. Well, after 5 days of travel, the carriage finally returned to the familiar gray tower. Under the setting sun, the ancient and majestic structure was tinged with a layer of orange light. When paired with the deep night sky in the east, it almost looked like it was ablaze. The carriage quickly entered the tower's first-level entrance designated for vehicles. Normally, after a simple inspection, apprentices returning from missions could disembark with their spoils and return to their dorms or laboratories. But today, the inspection of this carriage was oddly slow. Even so, the people waiting inside remained silent, as if they didn't mind the delay at all. Finally, the second-rank apprentice in charge of the inspection stammered, "Everything checks out. You may disembark now." At the same time, two figures appeared near the tower's entrance. One was Lakai, the president of the Mutual Aid Society. The other was third-rank apprentice Jiro, who wore a mocking expression. "I'm afraid you'll need to wait a moment." Lakai stepped forward, a worried look on his face. He spoke toward the carriage with its door still shut. "Saul, although you managed to escape the cursed domain of Blood Sail Town, just to be safe, we need to conduct a full-body inspection." After speaking, Lakai tilted his head slightly. But all he got in return was the restless snorting of the horses. He narrowed his eyes and rechecked the carriage's spiritual energy signatures. One was Byron, the other was Saul. Though the second presence was faint, Lakai was certain it was Saul. To him, spiritual energy was far more reliable than facial features. "Saul, you don't need to worry. I've brought along Mentor Monica's top student, Senior Jiro. You've seen him before. He's very skilled in curse-resisting magic." Still no response from inside the carriage. The smile on Lakai's face gradually faded. Jiro, standing near the entrance, twitched his shoulders. "You're sure Saul's in there?" "Of course," Lakai said confidently, though the prolonged silence had chipped away at that confidence. "Then what are we waiting for?" Jiro still wore his cocky grin as he walked straight to the carriage. "Open up." The door swung open. The person inside turned to look at them, and on his long neck a mouth split open, revealing sharp teeth. "Jiro." "Hey Byron, wanna do a mission together sometime?" Jiro joked, eyes sweeping the carriage interior non-stop. But aside from Byron, there was no one else inside. "Where, Saul? Don't tell me you hid him somewhere." Jiro widened his mouth in an exaggerated gulping motion. Byron ignored his teasing. Instead, he looked straight at Lakai, who had stepped up to the door with a sullen face. "Looking for Saul, he's not here." "Impossible. I definitely sensed his spiritual energy in this carriage." Lakai was still confident in his judgment. What he'd sensed had been active spiritual energy. That kind of fluctuation couldn't be faked by personal items or magical artifacts. Others might not be able to tell, but he could. Now, he suspected Saul was hiding somewhere with the help of some magical artifact. The question was how to find him. With a smile returning to his face, Lakai said, "Saul, you'd better come out. We just need to check you over, make sure nothing dirty came back with you. It's for your sake and everyone else." Still no response from inside. "If you won't come out, don't blame me for taking tougher measures." As soon as Lakai said that, Byron stood up inside the carriage. "You can continue your search. I'm heading back." Lakai hadn't planned to stop him, until the moment Byron stepped out of the carriage, and he suddenly realized that the source of Saul's spiritual energy had stepped out too. "Wait, Senior Byron." Lakai's voice trembled slightly as he rechecked. "Why is Saul's spiritual energy overlapping with yours? Did you hide him on your person?" Byron was known for being a lone wolf. Lakai didn't know much about him, only that he was skilled. Although he had only recently become a third-rank apprentice, his locator was highly unique and highly compatible with him. That made him one of the elite third-rank apprentices right away. That's the power of the locator. A mismatched one left third-rank apprentices riddled with hidden problems. Many ended up corrupted. Even a standard one only led to mediocrity. Becoming a true wizard remained just a pipe dream whispered under the covers. Which was why Locke always treated Byron with caution. Byron didn't show any displeasure at Locke's suspicion. He even nodded. If your definition of Saul is broad enough, then yes, part of him is with me. Locke frowned. Jiro, on the other hand, grinned with excitement. Byron held out his hand. Resting quietly in his palm was a grayish-white pinky finger. Locke's eyes widened. Saul's pinky fell off. I'm keeping it for him. He told me, ever since he returned from Mentor Anne's place last time, his pinky hasn't been all that strong. Chapter 305, Return. Before Locke and the others even showed up, Saul had already appeared at another entrance of the Wizard Tower. This passageway wasn't fit for carriages, but it led directly to the 5th floor of the East Tower. Back in the day, Mentor Kaz had personally taken him through it once. Completely wrapped in a wide cloak, Saul moved slowly, carefully watching every turn in the ramp. He didn't run into anyone along the way and made it to the 5th floor of the East Tower without issue. Once there, he glanced at the passages leading upward and downward, paused for a moment in thought, then chose to go down. For the sake of the grinding sound fruit and the mark inside him, he wanted the first person he encountered upon returning to the Wizard Tower to be the Tower Master. Anyone else who approached him could potentially be the one maintaining the mark of the soul-devouring flower. To meet the Tower Master, Saul had two options. Go up to the 19th floor. He had access to the Master's private library there, or head to the second storage room and request the Master to come down. Weighing the distance and safety of both options, Saul decided it was better to trouble the Master a little. Uncertain how long it would take for the people stationed at the tower entrance to realize he wasn't actually in the carriage, Saul quickened his pace again. It was nearing 6 in the evening, when most apprentices were wandering the 6th floor's library, registry room, or various laboratories. As Saul went further down, he encountered fewer and fewer people. But when he reached the 2nd floor of the East Tower, he unexpectedly ran into Curum, who had just stepped out of the 2nd morgue. This first-rank apprentice had taken over Saul's previous position in the morgue, and had even once used his companion Fairy to provoke Saul when they first met. Yet today, he had just come out of Hayden's 2nd morgue. Saul instinctively glanced inside the morgue but didn't see anyone else. Only a few corpses, suspended midair by ropes, swayed as if moved by wind that wasn't there. Although Curum was a little curious about someone suddenly appearing on the 2nd floor, he didn't try to peek beneath the cloak. The longer he'd stayed in the Wizard Tower, the more thoroughly his previous impulsiveness and arrogance had been washed away. He'd learned what it meant to speak cautiously and to restrain his curiosity. To his surprise, the cloaked figure stopped in front of him. Though the man didn't turn his body, his voice floated out. "Where's Hayden?" "Senior Hayden." Curum finally lifted his head slightly and gave Saul a glance. "He applied to leave the tower early a month ago and is no longer here. I'm currently in charge of the 2nd morgue." "He actually left already." Saul gave a stiff nod and didn't respond further. He simply walked straight into the dark corridor. Curum remained standing in place, only lifting his head to peer down the 2nd floor hallway once Saul's figure had vanished from sight. "That looked like Senior Saul," Curum muttered. Atop his head, his companion Fairy, which looked like a mud creature, shared his wide-eyed, open-mouthed expression. "Whoa, he's changed so much. Feels like his aura's way stronger now. Could he have already advanced to 3rd rank?" He shook his head repeatedly right after saying it. "No way, no way. He only just became 2nd rank not that long ago." But even as he denied it aloud, he was already convinced in his heart that Saul had advanced. I want to be that kind of powerful apprentice too, and then get accepted as a disciple by the Tower Master. Guagua, you think I've got a chance?" The companion fairy on his head gave a little jump, snapping Curum out of his daydream. I've gotta go exchange materials. If I'm late, my sister will rot." Saul, for his part, had no idea that a mere first-rank apprentice like Curum would be so shocked. He was still reeling from Hayden's abrupt departure. When other people take in underlings, the newbies kneel and worship them. Why is it that when I want a follower, the guy packs his bags and leaves ahead of time? He shook his head and pushed open the door to the second storage room, emotions tangled. It had been nearly a month, but he was finally back here. He wondered how the apprentice who'd taken over his duties was doing. Inside, the apprentice now working in the storeroom was going around with a lighting tool, maintaining the number of candles. When Saul got a look at the person's face, he was a little surprised. "Cugin." Cugin glanced sideways and, upon seeing Saul, merely gave a slight nod before turning back to lighting the candelabras. "Wait a second. These candles are acting up today, need mental energy to keep them from going out again." Having worked in the second storeroom for many years before, Cugin was highly experienced. Today, some of the candelabras had flames that kept flickering out. The number of burning candles had dropped dangerously close to below 90. Cugin carefully lit each candle and shielded the flame from going out again. It was thanks to his experience that he wasn't flustered and sweating like another apprentice might be. And as the previous storeroom manager who'd been replaced by Saul, Cugin clearly wanted to show off a bit in front of him. But while he was busy maintaining the flames, he didn't notice Saul sweeping a glance at the perfectly arranged corpses once he realized the number of lit candles was getting too low. Then quite suddenly, Cugin found his job becoming absurdly easy. Each candle now lit up instantly, with no need to stand watch for minutes afterward to see if it would go out again. He lit 20 candles in a row, then put down his lighting tool and looked around the now much brighter hall, utterly dazed. The whole experience felt like a dream. "Looks like the crisis has passed. As expected of you, Senior Cugin," Saul said with a genuine smile, praising him as he walked with steady steps through the ranks of corpses toward his workbench. His eyes scanned over the cabinets and tables, confirming that the seals he'd left before leaving were all intact. His mental energy marks on them hadn't been changed either. "Need me to go over anything? I can do the handover any time." Cugin followed with the lighting tool in hand, a faintly proud smile still on his face. Clearly, his success lighting over 20 candles in a row had him feeling pleased. "It's fine," Saul said, turning to him and tugging off his cloak. "But if I remember right, you weren't the one I handed things over to when I left, were you?" Cugin didn't look flustered at all. He smoothly set the lighting tool aside and pulled out the storeroom's registration book. "The apprentice who took over from you went to see Mentor Kaz after 3 days and voluntarily gave up the position." Saul frowned. "Why?" Cugin paused for a second before handing him the book. Not everyone has the nerve to deal with the mentors, and he was unlucky. 3 days in, and he was sent to deliver materials to Mentor Rum and Mentor Ann's. Ended up being forced to help out in Ann's lab for a whole afternoon. Word is, he came back barely alive. Back when Saul was on this job, that kind of thing rarely happened. Sometimes he'd go an entire month without a single assignment and almost forget he even had a job here. He thought to himself, so the newbie who replaced me got scared off right away. Were the mentors doing it on purpose, trying to switch out the person in charge of the storeroom? Could Cugin be the one maintaining the mark? Chapter 306, The Manual. But Saul quickly overturned this line of thought himself. If Cugin had taken over the second storage room 3 days after Saul left, then at that time, Saul hadn't yet been branded with the soul-devouring flower. He hadn't even arrived in Grindsail Town yet, so theoretically, the plan to brand him hadn't even started. Kyujin's appearance should have nothing to do with the mark. Both Rum and Ans issued tasks within those 3 days. Could there be some connection between them? Was assigning Kyujin to the storage room done with another purpose in mind? Even though he figured it unlikely that Kyujin was the mark's sustainer, Saul still had the diary release the flattened, weakened mark, just to be sure. There was no reaction from the mark. As expected, the sustainer would need frequent contact with me, and Kyujin clearly doesn't fit that condition. Kyujin had no idea that at the moment Saul accepted the manual and imprinted his mental power onto it. He had already thought through so many things. Kyujin only glanced around a bit, seeming faintly wistful after letting go, then took the initiative to say goodbye and exited the second storage room. After Kyujin left, Saul, out of caution, checked the mark again. Still no change. He didn't delay any further and immediately used the communication pen to inform the tower master of his return, requesting that he come in person. Now it all depends on how the tower master decides to deal with this mark. Saul finally let out a breath after writing the final word. The tower master would probably arrive quickly upon seeing the message, but it was also possible he was busy and would need to delay. Still, Saul was confident that this time, Lady Yura wouldn't be sent in his place again. While waiting, Saul remained mentally tense. To keep himself occupied, he picked up the manual Kyujin had just handed over and began reviewing the storage records during his absence. As Kyujin had said, the first senior who temporarily took over Saul's duties had been hit with 2 tasks right after starting. Saul carefully reviewed the task requirements and found they weren't for particularly important materials. At the very least, none had official serial numbers. But the deadlines from the mentors had all been rather tight, so that senior had likely been running around in a panic for some time. And with his repeated requests afterward to be transferred, Saul guessed that mentor Rum or Ans might have even scolded him. Seen this way, it really does seem like they were intentionally pushing him out. Saul flipped to the next page. Kyujin had taken over the storage room. During his time in charge, a few mentors continued submitting tasks. Overall, it had clearly been busier than when Saul had been there. Work tended to bully the newcomers. Fresh hands always attracted the trickiest problems. During his half-month at the second storage room, Kyujin had received 4 assignments. 2 from Mentor Ans, 1 from Mentor Monica, and 1 from Mentor Kaz. Mentor Kaz, Saul flipped to the next page. Kaz's task was an intake and transfer. The item was Nick's corpse. A dark light flickered through Saul's eyes, though his face remained expressionless. He kept reading. The body has just been processed and is currently being stored in a stone coffin to air out. Saul closed the manual and got up to go inspect the stone coffin. Airing out was, just like Saul's habit of calling corpses guests, a euphemism. It meant a brief period of isolation and observation to monitor for any further anomalies. Since he was now back on duty, Saul naturally had to inspect this dangerous item. Just as he stood up, a hand suddenly landed on his shoulder. Saul was about to break free, but then he caught a glimpse from the corner of his eye of the pink bandages wrapped around that hand, and instantly stopped his reflexive reaction. In the next second, darkness fell. Saul passed through a shadowy gap filled with countless eyes and arrived in a strange room in an instant. It was very dark. So dark that he thought, for a moment, that the spatial traversal hadn't yet ended. There were no ever-present candles like those in the Wizard Tower. Not a single one. Saul had to rely on semi-immersive meditation to barely make out his surroundings. "This is the very top floor of the Wizard Tower," said Gorsa, letting go of Saul and stepping back 2 paces. The room was so narrow that after just those 2 steps, Gorsa's back touched the wall. "Sit wherever you like." After taking a good look around, Saul realized how unusually cramped this room really was. Barely a meter wide and just over 2 meters long. Calling it a room was generous. It could barely fit a single bed. And right now there was no bed, not even a chair, just a soft carpet spread across the floor. It looked more like a coffin. If Saul really took Gorsa's suggestion to sit wherever, he'd have no choice but to sit on the floor. So he chose to remain standing. Gorsa seemed to have only been polite. Since Saul didn't sit, he didn't comment further. "I can tell your soul body is remarkably stable. You've already fused with the locator, haven't you?" Saul was surprised but kept his face earnest as he nodded. "Yes, Tower Master, you could tell." Gorsa didn't explain how he'd noticed. He simply stared at Saul for a while, then said with a hint of admiration, "You've just entered 3rd rank, yet you've already fused the locator into your soul body. You've overcome the hardest step in advancing from apprentice to true wizard." So it was like that, Saul thought. The hardest step in my apprentice phase was turning the diary into my locator, but once I did, I reached a level in this regard close to that of a true wizard. "You came to me right after reaching 3rd rank. Looks like the enemy you encountered this time was troublesome. Tell me, what happened in Grind Sail Town and the Black Castle?" Saul licked his dry lips and began slowly recounting everything he had experienced over the past month. He had already considered along the way what to say and what to omit, so his storytelling now came smoothly. Gorsa merely listened quietly. In the darkness, it was impossible to gauge his emotions. But Saul instinctively felt that he was calm throughout. As if Nightmare Butterfly being killed by Kismet, Saul being ambushed at the Black Castle, or the suspicion toward Kemaduchi were all trivial matters. Gorsa only moved his neck slightly when Saul mentioned the strange fluctuation in his soul body during the fight with Cadiz. When Saul finished, the room once again fell into silence. The Tower Master across from him remained still, as if turned to stone. Then Saul heard a shuffling sound. Squinting hard into the dark, he saw Gorsa slide down against the wall and sit on the floor. A live demonstration of what "sit wherever you like" meant. In the darkness, Gorsa seemed utterly at ease, but Saul sensed something a little off about him. "Tower Master, are you all right?" "I'm fine, just thinking about what you've been through. Trouble and accidents really seem to follow you closely." A soft chuckle drifted from the other side. In this darkness, Saul couldn't make out his expression at all. "Did he bring me here just so I wouldn't be able to observe his state?" Saul lowered his gaze. Gorsa continued, "Kismet will soon be forced to leave the Western continent. You don't need to worry about that. As for the one who ambushed you outside the Black Castle, it's almost certainly a land drifter. They wouldn't have attacked you without a reason. It's not worth the cost." He asked Saul about the disturbance he'd sensed within his soul body. "Do you still feel anything wrong?" Saul paid attention to the faintly flickering near-death mark inside him while furrowing his brow and recalling carefully. "I don't feel anything wrong now. Maybe it was just my imagination." "Then let me take a look." Gorsa said it casually, yet made no move to get up. Saul was still puzzled when he suddenly saw something lunge at him from the darkness ahead. But Gorsa still sat where he was. Chapter 307, Peering In. Faced with the shadow that suddenly appeared between Gorsa and himself, Saul's nerves instantly tensed. He nearly cast soul armor. But remembering that the Tower Master might be examining his soul body, he quickly forced himself to relax. The diary didn't give any warning. Saul was a little nervous. The diary had already become his locator, its connection with him growing deeper and deeper. He didn't know if Gorsa would sense the diary's presence if he used some special method to observe his soul body. But with the shadow approaching ever closer, Saul had no choice but to continue trusting in the diary's power. The shadow moved swiftly. Within the blink of an eye, it was standing directly in front of Saul. Its figure was long and slender, but paper-thin. For a moment, Saul even thought it might be Lady Yura stored inside Gorsa. When Lady Yura appeared in her shadow state, she looked just like this, like a paper-thin silhouette. But he quickly dismissed the idea. This shadow felt completely different from Lady Yura. It wasn't irritable, nor was it angry. It simply stood there silently. As it leaned forward to peer down at Saul, its outline vaguely overlapped with Gorsa's form. But it wasn't Gorsa, because the Tower Master himself was still sitting in the corner across from Saul. The shadow stared at Saul. Though Saul couldn't see its eyes, it continued to lean in closer. Its movements were slow, but as it gradually approached, the world before Saul began to distort. Saul kept his gaze locked on the shadow, but as time passed, his focus started to zero in on the shadow's face. The figure before him grew clearer and clearer, while the surroundings blurred away. In his peripheral vision, the room seemed to stretch under an invisible force. Gorsa, who had been just 2 meters away, now seemed 10 meters off. Was this room always this big, or has my vision been twisted by some magic? Saul thought vaguely. He had the faint feeling that something wasn't right, but couldn't figure out what exactly. The shadow drawing ever closer had completely consumed his attention. He no longer had the mental energy to think about why the walls beside him had turned curved, or when the Tower Master ahead had become a distant blur. He just wanted to keep looking at the shadow, to look closely, hopping to make out the shadow's features within the blur. Yes, Saul felt he was just about to see it clearly, just a little closer, just a little more. Rustle. Suddenly, the sound of flipping pages snapped Saul out of his trance. He jolted, finally noticing the diary flipping pages inside his soul body. It was only flipping through blank white pages. No text appeared. It wasn't a warning. This isn't a crisis warning. It's the diary helping me stabilize my consciousness. Now that he was alert, Saul realized the diary was doing its job as his locator. Even with his awareness back, Saul noticed his soul body remained in a disturbingly lax state. It was as if his mind had sobered up, but his body hadn't caught on yet. His soul body was like a grand mansion, with the owner gone and the doors left wide open. Anyone who happened to look this way could walk right in, roam around at will, and maybe even leave with something valuable. This has to be the Tower Master's ability. It feels like it's anesthetizing my awareness. Saul thought, growing anxious, though his reaction still felt sluggish. The shadow continued to inch forward, and his view of the world kept stretching further and further. The far end of the room now looked 100 meters away. The closer this shadow gets, the more the world stretches, and the distortion is growing exponentially. If it keeps going, my perception of the room could extend into hundreds, even thousands of meters. If it touches me, will my entire world become some endless corridor? I can't let it touch me. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding like thunder. He had never felt such an acute sense of danger. This wasn't a threat of death. It was a collapse of perception. Even if he didn't die, Saul was sure that if the shadow touched him, he'd go insane. Yet the diary still didn't respond. For the first time, Saul's instincts were screaming, but the diary remained motionless. The shadow was now only a centimeter or two away. Saul's sluggish mind finally remembered, run. Even though the room was physically quite small, he had to try and escape. Even just a few centimeters would count. Back up, back up, back up. Saul frantically told himself to dodge, like someone caught in a nightmare desperately trying to wake up. With great effort, his neck finally moved. It tilted slightly backward, just enough to pull Saul's head away from the shadow by 1 centimeter. But that 1 centimeter of retreat made the shadow suddenly halt. Then, like a spring stretched to its limit, the shadow straightened up sharply. In that instant, as the shadow stood upright, the distorted world around Saul snapped back. Everything shrank, collapsing in a flash back to normal. As the view returned to normal, the shadow vanished with it. The Tower Master Gorsa was still quietly sitting in the corner, just 2 meters away. As if nothing had happened. Your locator is quite good, but what surprised me even more was your willpower. It's just as tenacious as it was the night we first met. Saul was breathing lightly, but that was only because he was doing his best to keep control. Silently, he moved his hands behind his back, tugging at the sweat-soaked shirt clinging to him. It had been a long time since he'd sweat like this. Tower Master, that, just now what was that? Saul's voice was still shaking. Just observing your soul body to see if there were any of the abnormalities you mentioned. Gorsa rested his arms on his knees. But your locator blocked my vision, so I wasn't able to see through your soul body. I didn't find anything unusual. The diary blocked Gorsa's probing. Saul was surprised. Either the diary had protected him too well, or the soul-devouring flower's mark had been planted too deeply. To find it, one would have to thoroughly inspect every corner of his soul body. But that would risk revealing Saul's secrets. So, even if only to protect itself, the diary had to stop the intrusion. But if that's the case, won't the Tower Master be unable to confirm the Land Drifter's scheme? Saul's gaze dimmed. I can't just tell him outright that I've been marked by the soul-devouring flower. Saul shouldn't even know that name. So he only nodded, thanking the Tower Master. Thank you, Tower Master. I must have been too sensitive. No, I believe in your intuition. To his surprise, even though he hadn't discovered anything, Gorsa affirmed Saul's instincts. The fact that I didn't find anything just means the opponent's methods aren't low-level. Saul heard a soft laugh. What are the Land Drifters best known for anyway? It's nothing but their reliance on the soul-devouring flower. He bought it. Saul looked up with feigned surprise. The soul-devouring flower, that name sounds like it targets the soul. Gorsa slowly stood. The way he stood was strange. He didn't brace himself with his hands or retract his ankles. He simply rose up, like a balloon man being inflated. Saul vaguely saw him twist his neck. That's right, but more accurately, the soul-devouring flower targets consciousness. Chapter 308, Master. Consciousness, soul, Saul unconsciously repeated the words. He knew that these two concepts couldn't be equated, but the knowledge he had studied before had never clearly defined either term. You should have already studied these concepts. But the books never gave a clear definition. That's right, you're not ready to know yet. It's like walking, you can do it just fine. But if someone asked you to consciously control each muscle and bone involved, you'd probably be unable to move. Saul nodded thoughtfully. Still, I don't understand why the people of the Land Drifters would go to such great lengths just to affect my consciousness. I'm just an apprentice, after all. Gorsa chuckled softly again. You think they targeted you as a way to get at me? Saul didn't reply, but that was exactly what he'd always assumed. This time, upon his return, he deliberately asked Senior Byron to divert everyone else's attention, just so he could report the matter to the Tower Master immediately and discreetly. Although Gorsa was a standout among second-rank wizards, it would be impossible for him to go up against the entire Land Drifters faction alone. Not to mention, the Land Drifters clearly had allies. You really believe you're just a pawn used to counter me? Didn't you just take down a veteran third-rank apprentice on your own? Saul was taken aback. He had grown so accustomed to identifying as a low-level wizard apprentice that he'd never considered he might have any value worth exploiting. But in the eyes of the Tower Master, he apparently had already grown into someone worth manipulating, at great cost, no less. Are you saying the land drifters really want to control me? It's not impossible. Don't forget, you are already my student. Doesn't that status alone speak to your value? The Tower Master spoke with no shortage of confidence. Saul lowered his head slightly, but then suddenly seemed to realize something and looked up sharply. Tower Master, do you mean? Call me Master. Saul's eyes widened in disbelief. Gorsa had officially acknowledged him. But what about Master Kaz? Of course, Saul knew better than to ask such a foolish question right now. Instead, he responded immediately, Yes, Master. Gorsa nodded with a smile, then brought the conversation back. At this point, we can be fairly certain that someone tampered with your soul body, likely due to the influence of the land drifter's soul-devouring flower. Then how do I get rid of its effects? Perhaps we can use this influence to flush out the enemies hiding within the wizard tower. Saul's eyes lit up. That had been his idea too, though he hadn't dared to say it aloud. I don't know much about the soul-devouring flower. It's a secret known only to the land drifters' core members. But judging from their previous tactics and your current situation, I can deduce that it's likely a power that can influence a person's consciousness, thereby controlling their behavior or thoughts. There are 3 types of remote control. One uses demonic creatures, another uses mental radiation, and the third, you're not ready to know yet. The soul-devouring flower is that powerful anyway. The first 2 methods are already very difficult to maintain over long periods, especially now that you're back in the wizard tower. If they want to keep influencing you, they'll need to sustain the connection constantly. Saul blinked slowly. Did the Tower Master, no, Master Gorsa, really not know the full capabilities of the soul-devouring flower? Because it sounded like he'd guessed it all almost exactly. Gorsa could see Saul's surprise, though he clearly couldn't guess the reason behind it. For now, make sure you carry the puppet I gave you with you at all times, Gorsa said, tilting his head slightly. Don't tell me you threw it away. No, Saul replied quickly. I just didn't bring it on my recent trips outside. But his tone lacked confidence. In truth, he deliberately avoided carrying the red-eyed puppet Gorsa had given him, because he wanted to hide the diary. After all, Lady Yura had once hidden herself inside it. Saul feared it might still contain some form of surveillance from Gorsa. And the last thing he could afford was for anyone to know about his most important secret. Of course, Kismet already knew everything, but that was an unfortunate exception, a walking time bomb. Precisely because of Kismet's unexpected discovery, Saul had grown more certain. The fewer people who knew about the diary, the better. Fortunately, Gorsa didn't press him about the puppet. He simply reminded him again, from now on, carry it at all times. Yes, Master, Saul responded. After all, the diary was now embedded in his soul body, and he was sure it could withstand Gorsa's mental probes. That red-eyed puppet, he could deal with it easily. That puppet can temporarily house a soul body and is extremely sensitive to mental energy. Feed it a certain amount of your mental power, and it will memorize your mental pattern. In the future, if anyone or anything tries to influence the soul-devouring flower inside your soul body, the puppet will detect it. Its eyes will turn black, and it will alert you. So that's what it was for. When the Gorsa had given him the puppet, he'd probably already suspected his soul body might be compromised. Thank you, Master. Gorsa nodded. Once you leave this room, do not mention the land drifters or the soul-devouring flower again, not even to yourself. Leave this room. A flurry of guesses flashed through Saul's mind, but before he could ask, his vision was suddenly filled with light. Familiar doors and rows of bookshelves. He realized he was standing in the private library on the 19th floor. Saul, a deep, raspy voice called from behind. Saul turned around and saw Kaz standing in the hallway. Master, what are you doing here? Saul quickly walked over. Kaz looked at him with a complicated expression. You've already become a third-rank apprentice. You advanced even faster than when you reached the second rank. His back seemed even more hunched, the wrinkles on his face more pronounced. The Tower Master has better judgment than I do. Looking at his old master, Saul didn't quite know what to say, but Kaz clearly didn't need any comforting. The Tower Master asked me to wait for you here. Since you've been acknowledged by him and become his student, don't call me master anymore. Just call me Mentor Kaz like everyone else. Saul had never intended to stop recognizing Kaz as his master, even after becoming Gorsa's student. But before he could say anything, Kaz raised his right hand and waved it lightly. Saul noticed a charred black mark in his palm. A fresh injury, most likely. Don't refuse. Honestly, I was planning to give up on you in the beginning. Kaz's face carried a relieved smile. He turned and gestured for Saul to follow. The two of them walked toward the ramp connecting the tower's levels. It was the Tower Master who asked me to give you a chance, to let you work in the corpse chamber. Saul had already guessed as much, so he wasn't surprised. It was then that I noticed you had an unexpected affinity for dark element spells. This wasn't the same as your elemental sensitivity talent. It was a way of thinking, a set of habits that suited the dark element perfectly. You weren't disgusted by dealing with corpses and filth every day. In fact, you even had the nerve to use materials from those corpses to modify your own body. Kaz couldn't help glancing at Saul again, recalling his own astonishment at the time. And a bit of fear, because if he'd accidentally caused Saul's death after the Tower Master had just entrusted the boy to him, he didn't know if he'd have gotten off easy. It wasn't until then that I realized your true talent. Focusing solely on numbers like magic power and mental strength, that was my narrow-mindedness. Watching Kaz constantly reflect on his past misjudgments, Saul tried several times to interject but never managed to get a word in. Kaz was especially sentimental today. The two of them walked all the way to the ramp, then ascended, arriving at the 20th floor. It was Saul's first time there. The 20th floor was unlike any other level of the Wizard Tower. At the entrance stood a pair of bronze doors, identical to the ones on the ground floor of the East Tower. Kaz stepped forward and placed both hands, left and right, on the doors. From this moment on, you are officially authorized to participate in the Tower Master's experiments. I will now brief you on the details. Chapter 309, Resurrection. Saul stood at the entrance to the 20th floor of the Wizard Tower, watching as Kaz pressed both hands against the bronze double doors and pushed them open with great effort. It was pitch black inside. As the doors gradually opened, candlelight from the corridor slanted into the growing gap. Heedy sosoro. Slurp slurp. Buzz. For a moment, Saul thought he saw something lurking behind the doors, things shrinking away from the candlelight, scattering like frightened insects. At the same time, eerie noises like children giggling seeped into his mind. Kaz didn't step inside immediately. He paused, catching his breath, and said to Saul, "This door is different from the one on the first floor of the East Tower. You have to open both sides at once, then wait a while. Let the light drive away the little things inside before going in." He paused again, clearly winded. It seemed that pushing open the bronze doors had drained him unusually. Then Saul heard him mutter self-deprecatingly, "Getting old, my eyesight's gone, and my mental strength's not what it used to be. Once we're inside, mark the door lock with your mental energy. That way, you can come and go on your own in the future." Kaz did look extremely old, but Saul knew that once a person advanced to become a true wizard, there were many ways to extend their life. What truly cut short a wizard's lifespan wasn't aging. It was the unforeseen dangers and accidents that could strike at any time. From the way Kaz spoke, it seemed he genuinely felt his age catching up with him. By now, the strange whispering and chittering from behind the doors had ceased, yet Kaz still didn't step inside. It was as if he were waiting for something. Saul had a thought. Perhaps Kaz was waiting for the last of those little things to flee. Only after standing there for another 3 minutes did Kaz finally step inside, with Saul following close behind. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped by more than 10 degrees. The Wizard Tower was already cool year-round, the ambient temperature rarely rising above 10 degrees Celsius. But the wizards and apprentices had far stronger constitutions than ordinary people. They never felt cold, much less caught a chill. Still, the sudden plunge to sub-zero temperatures made Saul shiver. He wore only a long robe and a drafty cloak that let in wind from all sides. For a moment, the cold bit into him. But then, his skin began to give off a faint heat. It instinctively resisted the external chill. Before long, Saul no longer felt uncomfortable at all. As he walked, he glanced down at his naturally swinging arms. My skin conducts mental energy and magic with ease. Was it reacting to my desire to warm up, and so began to heat itself? The second-generation soul resin is truly a massive upgrade over the first-gen plastic bones. Once he had acclimated to the chill, Saul finally lifted his head to take in the laboratory before him. He was instantly surprised to find it was an enormous circular chamber. A single, unpartitioned space. Apart from the entrance ramp and the bronze doors, the lab occupied the entirety of the 20th floor. What filled this lab wasn't materials or apparatuses, but rows upon rows of cold, stone coffins. They were arranged just like the corpses in the second storage vault, in neat, uniform lines, each coffin spaced exactly 1 meter apart. Some coffins were sealed tight with lids, others had lids that were slightly ajar, and some had their lids leaning against the side, exposing the contents entirely. It didn't feel like a lab at all. It felt more like a morgue. Saul followed in Kaz's footsteps, moving slowly forward. Their footsteps were barely audible, as if afraid to disturb the slumbering souls that lay within. Yet Saul doubted whether these things had souls at all. As he passed one of the half-open coffins, curiosity made him glance inside, only to find a very familiar wooden puppet, the kind used to test mental aptitude. It was identical to the ones Kaz and Mentor Rum used in their tests. How this one earned a place in a coffin was anyone's guess. Saul leaned a bit closer as he passed, intrigued. Suddenly, the puppet inside, which had been lying quietly, shifted to face him, turning 30 degrees in his direction. It had no joints in its neck, so the whole body rotated. One shoulder rose slightly off the stone surface, hovering unsupported in the air. As Saul's gaze swept across its hollow eye sockets, the familiar plea rang in his mind again. But unlike before, he didn't feel dizzy or mentally drained at all. The diary still floated gently within his soul body. Undisturbed, its pages closed, as if refusing to even acknowledge the puppet's existence. As Saul kept walking, the puppet kept subtly rotating to follow him. Its eyes never left him, but that was all it could do. The eerie display didn't even make Saul pause. Perhaps because he hadn't stared for long, it didn't release that usual, heart-wrenching "kill me." Throughout it all, Kaz gave no instructions. He clearly considered everything in this lab to be safe, or at least safe for Saul. The second coffin they passed lay completely open. Inside was a woman dressed in immaculate clothing. At first glance, Saul thought she was a perfectly preserved corpse. But with a second look, he realized it wasn't a human body. It was a lifelike imitation, made of some kind of unknown material. A full-scale, anatomically accurate human doll. Saul's expression grew a little complicated. Is this entire room filled with puppets like these? Though Kaz hadn't looked back once, he clearly understood Saul's reaction. Every first-time visitor to this circular lab had the same look, shocked or thrilled. As you guessed, Kaz finally said once they reached the round table at the center of the room, these are human models made from all sorts of materials, different sizes, different substances. Most of them, however, are corpses repurposed into puppets, though we call them vessels. I suppose you've already guessed our research focus. Saul nodded. The Tower Master once told me he wanted to resurrect Lady Yura. Kaz's expression wavered. His voice grew airy, almost dreamlike. Yes, resurrection. He placed one hand on the table and closed his eyes, as if gathering his thoughts. It's a tremendously difficult subject. Our only real advantage is that the soul in the Tower Master's possession is whole, lucid, and has neither turned into a wraith nor been corrupted into an evil spirit. So our experiments are, in a way, starting from the second half of the process. But even then, our progress has been painfully slow. Kaz let out a sigh. Truthfully, the domain of death and resurrection is something only fourth-rank wizards usually touch. They're the ones who explore the essence of space and life. Some powerful fourth ranks can even transition between life and death multiple times. So laugh if you must. At first, I didn't believe in this experiment. I thought it was dangerously ahead of its time. It would only bring us risk and corruption. But the Tower Master, Kaz tilted his head and gave Saul a knowing look. He's always had a fondness for tackling high-tier fields. Chapter 310, Division of Labor. Slaying monsters above one's rank was extremely dangerous, but the rewards were equally tremendous. Even if he wasn't the adventurous type at heart, Saul could still fully understand Gorsa's mindset. Achieving feats that only a fourth-rank wizard could accomplish, while still being a second rank, just the thought of it was enough to stir one's blood. In fact, Gorsa had already managed part of it. He had mastered spatial magic that only fourth-rank wizards were typically capable of using, although the spells he used likely came with major limitations. It was still enough to make him a second-rank wizard who could proudly stand above the rest of the Western continent. Rumor had it even some third-rank wizards treated him with great respect. What man didn't yearn for that kind of status and power? Kaz caught sight of the fire burning in Saul's eyes. He turned away expressionlessly, but a sigh stirred quietly in his heart. Still young, faced with a challenge, all he sees is the joy of success. He hasn't even begun to consider the hardship ahead. Will he be defeated? And how long can he hold on to that passion? Kaz gave Saul 3 minutes, whether to think or daydream, and then began explaining the full scope of the resurrection experiment. There are 2 major challenges in resurrection. First, the soul. Second, the body. The Tower Master handles the first. A soul after death constantly leaks spiritual energy and is highly susceptible to corruption. Once it transforms into a wraith or worse, there's no bringing it back, at least not within the bounds of any knowledge I possess. To preserve Lady Yura's soul in both integrity and purity, he made tremendous sacrifices. He even went so far as to modify his own body, just so he could store her soul long-term. Saul thought back to when he first saw Lady Yura's full form. In the end, she had merged into the Tower Master's body and was carried away by him. So Lady Yura normally resides inside the Tower Master's body. It's not that simple. If a human body alone could contain a soul, we wouldn't be going through all this trouble to find or create a suitable vessel. Kaz swept his hand toward the stone coffins before them. Clearly, each was prepared as a potential vessel for reviving Lady Yura. But it was just as clear that none had truly met the requirements. Otherwise, Kaz wouldn't have worn such a broken, defeated look on his face. It was the expression of someone thoroughly crushed, numbed into resignation. Yes, I really am useless. As for what the Tower Master's responsible for, I won't get into that, since I don't fully know myself. What we, you included, are responsible for is finding or creating a container that can hold Lady Yura's soul for a long time. I see, Saul said, recalling his time as a student in the Wizard Tower. Many things had pointed toward this all along. Working in the corpse room, sorting contaminated from uncontaminated materials. Taking part in soul infusion observation experiments, led by Mentor Rum and Senior Nick. Studying magic related to souls, and managing the second storage room, where he learned about materials beyond the human body. And yet, Saul still didn't understand why the Tower Master had chosen him. Was it because of his strong mental aptitude? But then he wasn't assigned to soul preservation. His task was vessel creation. Wouldn't it make more sense to assign someone with deeper knowledge and more experience? Or maybe they thought a fresh perspective might spark new ideas. If that were the case, then wouldn't it be better to just share the experiment data and let everyone brainstorm? The Tower Master distributed tasks based on each mentor's area of expertise. For example, Mentor Ans and I are mainly responsible for creating vessels. I specialize in using human material for construction. Ans, being a specialist in the earth element, selects much more unusual materials, like the fat on Mentor Rum's body. Kaz immediately caught on to Saul's sudden realization and shook his head with a faint smile. If you're thinking of Mentor Rum's fat, no, that's not it. Though there are puppet vessels in this lab, they were ruled out long ago. These days, puppets are mostly used to test mental and soul stability to see if there's any sign of corruption. Then what's Mentor Rum in charge of? He and Mentor Gyudo are responsible for the compatibility between soul and vessel. Mentor Rum specializes in the water and light elements, makes sense. But Mentor Gyudo, isn't he all about poison and metal? I can't imagine someone who spends all day cooking up toxins studying souls. Kaz gave him a tired look. He passed off the toxin work to apprentices ages ago. We're so understaffed that everyone has to juggle multiple research fields. But Gyudo's amazing. He's found his own way forward. Rum focuses on modifying souls to adapt to vessels. Gyudo, on the other hand, modifies vessels to accept souls. He treats a vessel's rejection of a soul like a kind of toxin and approaches it as a detox problem. Saul's eyes lit up. That actually made sense. A true master of poison was often also a master of antidotes. That just left Mentor Monica, the only female wizard, the only one specialized in lightning magic. And let's face it, gorgeous. Her only flaw, she occasionally went from beauty to charred beauty. Monica, actually. Kaz looked hesitant but ultimately decided to speak the truth, realizing Saul would hear it eventually from someone else. Monica was created by Gorsa specifically for this resurrection experiment. She was forcibly made into a true wizard. Created, Saul was stunned. If it were really possible to manufacture true wizards, what need would there be for wizard apprentices? Yes, it cost a fortune and untold lives, Kaz said with a heavy sigh. It was something like 100, maybe 200 people. In the end, only Monica successfully advanced to true wizard, but the Tower Master only needed one lightning element wizard. The remaining dozen or so, once deprived of his protection, died off over the next year or two. And the useful materials from their corpses were all harvested and used to enhance Monica. Even without Kaz spelling it out, Saul had already guessed Monica's role. Her focus was lightning, an element especially effective at purging corruption. She was the key to keeping both soul and vessel uncontaminated. To keep the resurrection experiment running long-term, Gorsa had literally created his own disinfectant. Now that you've heard all this, you should have a decent grasp of the resurrection experiment. You're not the first apprentice to participate in it, but I hope you'll be the last. Saul understood. Kaz was desperate to see this experiment reach its end. The countless wrinkles on his face and the dullness in his eyes told the story. He might not even mind if the whole thing failed, as long as it was finally over. "I don't know," Saul murmured, staring at this man who looked as exhausted in spirit as he did in appearance, unsure how to respond. From everything Saul had learned so far, dark clouds had already begun to gather over the wizard tower. Gorsa's terrifying power was not the problem, but for Kaz, the days of rest and peace were probably still a long, long way off. Chapter 311, The Vessel. The circular laboratory on the 20th floor was the largest in area within the entire wizard tower. Every mentor had a place here. Saul was currently the only apprentice allowed to appear in this place. According to Kaz, Haywood and Kongsha had once held a spot here as well, but they quickly lost their qualifications and were expelled from the 20th floor. The only apprentice who wasn't kicked out was named Ivan, but he had gone too far in his own experiments, and in the end, his physical body completely disappeared. Only a lost soul remained, wandering the dormitory area every night in search of his body. Upon hearing Kaz's description of Ivan, Saul immediately recalled the gray shadow he had encountered during his few nocturnal walks through the wizard tower. Kaz sighed and said, "You must never use yourself for experiments carelessly." But as soon as he said it, he saw Saul, his skin pale gray, nodding in agreement. "Kaz, some rules clearly didn't apply to everyone." In the end, Kaz explained to Saul how to use the facilities in the circular laboratory and the precautions to take, then left him alone. Saul carefully made a round of the laboratory. Though it was called a laboratory, because it was a shared space for all mentors and experimental personnel, it had instead become a kind of exhibition hall for experimental results. The more dangerous or early-phase experiments were never conducted here. That wasn't a rule, just an unspoken understanding. If Saul wanted to conduct research here on his own, no one would stop him. After all, hardly anyone came here in the first place. Kaz had said he could choose to follow a mentor and participate in their experiments, or he could initiate his own independent project. There was no rush. He could first look over the experimental records, especially those that had been deemed failures or unworthy of further research. That way, he wouldn't waste time repeating the paths of others. As for whether Saul might come across dangerous knowledge, he was already third rank. Did he still need a mentor to hold his hand? After Kaz left, Saul didn't immediately go check the records or books. Instead, he was intrigued by the rows of stone coffins in the room. Some of the lids were wide open, some half open, some fully shut. It clearly wasn't just for storage. Each stone coffin had a small booklet tied to its side with a piece of hemp rope. These were obviously used to record relevant information. Saul walked up to the nearest fully sealed stone coffin and squatted down to examine it. The booklet recorded a number. Vessel number 1342. Do not open the coffin without permission. Non-humanoid, form is unstable, experiment suspended. For detailed information, see Floor 19, Room Bookshelf. Information last updated, year 311, January 1st. Saul flipped further into the booklet. The back contained status updates for number 1342 across different times. The last page was dated June 9th, year 310. After that, the update frequency rapidly increased. By July 310, there were even daily updates. But after August, the update pace suddenly dropped, eventually becoming just once a month. Until January 1st, year 311, when the experiment was suspended. From the records, Saul could imagine that the experimenters had begun with great enthusiasm and hope, perhaps even believing success was within reach at one point. But in the end, they failed. They racked their brains, trying to find the problem, and kept revising their methods. Yet after repeated failures, they must have realized they might have chosen the wrong direction entirely, or that a critical step had remained unsolved. In any case, the experiment was suspended. The only good news was that it wasn't terminated, just suspended. Saul stood up. Though curious about what was inside the stone coffin, he had no intention of opening it recklessly. The record clearly stated that its state was unstable. If opening it ruined the contents, that would destroy the result of countless hours of effort and betray the painstakingly chosen word: suspended. Saul browsed through a few more booklets beside other coffins and gradually identified a pattern. All of the fully sealed stone coffins contained suspended experiments. Presumably, those that had been terminated weren't even qualified to remain in the laboratory. The ones with just a crack open were mostly unstable or dangerous containers. Half-open or fully open ones were still in use, at least within the last month. If a stone coffin's lid was open, it meant the experiment was still ongoing. Saul swept his gaze across the room. With his powerful mental strength, he instantly calculated the number of unsealed coffins. Not many, just 12. As for the fully sealed ones, there were 117. Next, Saul returned to the circular experiment table at the center of the room. It was clearly meant for multiple people to use together. The tabletop was made up of multiple polygonal segments, and any of them could be moved in front of oneself if needed. There was also a pipe in the center of the table, reaching straight up to the ceiling. It could deliver required materials, including soul bodies. At first, Saul thought it was some kind of modern mechanical system, but when he opened the pipe's hatch, what he saw inside were the slender arms that had once passionately chased him. These arms were different from the ones he had seen outside the bronze gate on the first floor of the East Tower. Now, they were quiet and well-behaved, curling up inside the pipe. Saul didn't know if the arms still remembered him, but he sure remembered them clearly. Back when he traded candles with Ferguson, and when that ugly woman behind Haywood pulled his soul out, these noodle-like arms had tangled with him more than once. Why so well-behaved now? Saul propped his chin in his hand. Is it just because this isn't the rest of the East Tower? Because this is the Tower Master's lab? These arms clearly weren't as mindlessly chaotic as they had appeared. At the very least, they knew how to behave in front of the Tower Master. Though bickering with a bunch of broken, chaotic soul bodies was pointless. Bang! Saul slammed the pipe's hatch shut with a palm. One day, I'll use you all in my experiments. By now, Saul had explored most of the lab. Occasionally, a diary would pop up somewhere to warn him not to touch certain areas. Of course, with Saul's current insight, he could usually identify danger on his own. Next, I need to determine my research direction. Saul walked back to the bronze gate and, imitating Kaz, placed his hands on either side of the door. I already have an idea, I just don't know if it's feasible. As thoughts churned in his mind, he pushed open the door to the 20th floor. He stood in place for a moment, listening to the faint sounds behind the door fade away, then stepped out. But as soon as he took a step, the light before his eyes dimmed drastically. Saul turned around instantly and found that the bronze gate had already closed behind him. But the walls flanking it were not the walls of the 20th floor in the East Tower. The fine scratches on the wall told Saul that he was no longer on the 20th floor. He turned again to look at the shadowy corridor behind him, and finally realized that he had walked through the 20th floor's bronze gate and ended up outside the first-floor bronze gate of the East Tower. Chapter 312, Color Shift. Can the bronze gate really let me traverse space? Saul found it hard to believe. Did that mean every time he left the 20th floor, he would end up on the first floor of the East Tower? But the bronze gates on the first floor of the East Tower couldn't be opened simultaneously. Maybe it's a one-way passage, Or maybe it's a single-use gateway. I just asked my mentor for help. Maybe he thought it best I not wander around the wizard tower before I get the puppet. Whatever the reason, it was a great convenience for Saul. The first thing he did after returning to the second storage room was to retrieve the red-eyed puppet doll and stuff it into his pocket. Then Saul walked to the front of the corpse cluster in the storage room, checked the number of candle lamps, lit a few to replenish them, and came to a stop before Herman's body. He opened the diary within his soul body. This was the signal that he allowed the souls within to observe the outside world. Herman, can you see the corpse in front of me? Herman, yes, master, that is my body. His voice was strained. Clearly, the experience of seeing his own corpse was not pleasant. Sorry, I know it might be uncomfortable, but there are some things I need to confirm. Saul told them that whenever his soul left his body, he was often pulled into these corpses, despite them having no life left in them. Sometimes, he even saw the things these bodies had once seen. It was as if these corpses standing in the storage room weren't dead, but instead acted like monitors. Do you know why that is? The consciousnesses in the diary fell silent for a while, and then Agu was the first to speak. Agu, I once heard a theory. The soul relies on the body for protection, and the body relies on the soul. So at the brink of death, the body releases a massive surge of energy, its functions desperately trying to retain the soul. So you think our bodies also have consciousness? Agu, it's just a theory. There's no experiment that proves the body can have consciousness on its own. I think it might just be a rule of how life operates. Morden, I disagree. Being on the brink of death still isn't the same as being dead. The soul and consciousness are still present in the body, still exerting control. So I believe that the body's final struggle is the soul issuing one last command. Just like how some women, when pregnant, unconsciously prioritize protecting the child over their own life. That's the soul giving the body that order. Agu, then how do you explain the Dwarven Valley effect? Morden, I've never been to Dwarven Valley. Maybe the wizards back then just weren't powerful enough to detect the presence of a soul. Or maybe there were just lingering fragments of consciousness. Agu, you're calling a third-rank wizard not powerful enough. Hold on, both of you, stop arguing. Someone tell me, what is the Dwarven Valley effect? Saul quickly cut them off, seeing the two most knowledgeable souls about to clash again. Agu, there was once a third-rank wizard on another continent who tried to capture a group of dwarves. But when he entered the valley they lived in, he found that all the magic and mental power had vanished. It had become a no-magic domain. Any being with a soul that entered would feel immense rejection. If forced to go in, the soul would be forcibly ejected, leaving the body behind. But the body would continue forward, acting as if it still had a will. Agu, if the soul couldn't be drawn back using material means before the body got too far away, it would never be able to return. That place became a forbidden domain for all soul-based beings. Yet there are rumors that some have seen bodies still walking around the edge of Dwarven Valley. There's a place like that. Morden, Master, sometimes it's simply that we haven't uncovered the truth yet. That doesn't mean the laws of the world are being broken. Agu, oh, so you think the world's laws are already all known? Enough, Saul's expression darkened. I know academic circles love to argue, but don't forget, I'm the one asking the questions right now. The black pages belonging to Agu and Morden immediately fell silent, trembling faintly. Clearly, the anger of the diary's owner exerted immense pressure on the soul bound within its pages. Even Saul himself was surprised by how powerful that reaction was. He didn't rush to comfort the two hurt souls. Instead, he began sorting through the new information he'd just received. So right now, there are two mainstream theories. One is that the body acts on the soul's last command. The other is that the body itself can generate consciousness. Saul looked at the heavily modified Herman in front of him. Herman, I'm going to touch your body now. Let me know if you feel anything. From Saul's right palm, a translucent gray tentacle, shadowy in appearance, sprouted out. It was as thick as an adult's arm, but if needed, it could grow to half a meter in thickness, though that would shorten its length. The tentacle coiled around Herman's head, then slipped through his forehead. But it quickly withdrew. His brain is empty. Saul directed the tentacle to several other spots. This modified body of Herman's really had been altered quite a bit. Not just the brain, even the spine had been replaced with some other material. Its shape didn't even resemble a human spine anymore. Looking at this patchwork Herman, Saul quietly retracted his tentacle. Did you feel anything during that? Herman, my feelings are a bit complicated. His handwriting appeared sluggish, clearly shaken by what had just happened, but he quickly pulled himself together. Herman, I didn't feel anything different, though it might be because my perception is that sharp. Saul nodded. Or maybe there are too many barriers between you and your body now. Your sense of it isn't as clear. He stepped past Herman's corpse. There was also the possibility that Herman's body was different from the others in the corpse cluster. When Saul's soul had left his body, he had never been pulled into Herman. Maybe the newer members of the cluster didn't have the ability to draw in souls. Well, of course, the relationship between body and soul is one of the biggest mysteries in wizardry. It's not something I'd solve just like that. Still, Saul wasn't ready to give up. This time, he chose a body he had previously possessed and began probing it again. He had all the soul consciousnesses, including and focused together to see if any sensations could be detected. But once again, the four souls sensed nothing at all. Throughout this process, Agu and Morden didn't argue even once. They just quietly did what they were told. Oh right, we have a new member. Saul remembered that Nick's body was still airing out in the stone coffin. Maybe something fresh will be different. Though Saul still felt sad and wistful over Nick's death, when facing a corpse, he returned to being a rational wizard. Nick's stone coffin was in the corner of the storage room, with a few boxes stacked beside it, one of which had once been used by Saul as a makeshift step stool. He walked over and had little Algie open the box, while he stayed alert for any signs of corpse transformation. But Nick's corpse lay quietly, showing no signs of attack or escape. He lay there with the corners of his mouth slightly upturned, as if dreaming a pleasant dream. Saul had rarely seen Nick smile, of course. That time he smirked at Saul didn't count. Because Nick specialized in emotional magic, he was extremely restrained when it came to his own feelings. Whenever he sensed a wave of emotion rising, he would hide it away. Saul still remembered the pained sound of his laughter. That wasn't joy. That was torment. No abnormalities. He can go into the storage cluster. After completing his check, Saul was just about to lift Nick's body out when the diary flipped on its own. Agu, Master, you might want to take a look at the puppet you just put on yourself. Saul frowned and immediately pulled out the red-eyed doll from his pocket. When did this happen? His pupils shrank. At some point the puppet's eyes had turned black. Yet Saul had never even left the storage room since getting the puppet. Chapter 313, A Corpse's Memory. Saul clutched the puppet tightly in his hand. Its red crystal eyes had now turned completely black. It was sensing the influence of another's mental force. Saul immediately looked around. There's no way anyone else is here, and from the time I picked up the puppet to when its eyes changed, it's only been a few minutes. His expression grew more serious, so whatever changed it happened within those few minutes. His gaze swept across the lab table, the candlelight, and the group of corpses, finally landing on the corpse of Nick right in front of him. Agu, were you watching the puppet the entire time? Agu, apologies, Master. I was observing Nick's body when I happened to notice a trace of unusual mental fluctuations on you. It was different from your usual patterns. You were paying close attention while I was probing the other corpses just now, weren't you? Agu, yes, master. Then it's almost certain it was Nick that affected the puppet. Saul withdrew his gaze, eyes locking on Nick's corpse. Nick had died due to a failed advancement, so his body hadn't suffered much damage. And because there weren't many usable materials left, his appearance hadn't changed much either. Saul had the diary emit the soul-devouring flower signal. Sure enough, the faintly glowing mark began to blink in a steady rhythm. So the sustainer could be a corpse. Saul didn't move away from the signal. Instead, he leaned in closer. If I hadn't had multiple ways of detecting the mental energy directed at me, who would ever be wary of a corpse standing in the storage room? Someone definitely tampered with Nick's body, embedding the signal transmission method within him like a beacon. Whoever did it knew the corpses in the morgue rarely get dissected a second time. For any third-rank apprentice or above, that's common knowledge. Saul had initially assumed that locating the mark's sustainer would lead him straight to the enemy. He hadn't expected the other side to use a proxy, leaving the true manipulator still hidden in the shadows. Morden, master, I advise you not to tamper with the body. Otherwise, the person manipulating it may become aware. Saul nodded. But if the mental mark placed on me is designed to take effect soon, then showing no signs of influence at all might be suspicious too. Agu, in that case, we'd best try to decipher the information encoded in the mark. Saul sat on the edge of the stone coffin, staring at Nick's corpse. Since the ability to maintain the signal was assigned to a corpse, and corpses can't adapt on their own, not to mention outside forces might interfere, the signals it emits are likely very simple. Maybe we can decode them. Saul immediately ordered his mental projections to be on high alert. He was going to try infusing the mark with energy to amplify its signal and capture its unique mental wavelength. Little Algie hurried to hand him paper, a pen, and some instruments for measuring mental force. The souls didn't need paper or instruments. They would memorize and analyze everything internally. Saul carefully transferred the mark from beside the diary onto one of his spirit tendrils, then slowly brought it toward Nick's body. As it drew near, the foreign mental fluctuations became more and more distinct. Saul ignored the others and focused on deciphering the patterns, but mental fluctuations weren't a language, they felt more like code. And without a cipher, cracking it would be incredibly difficult. So he decided to start with the emotional impressions carried by the waves. Mental energy wasn't cold and emotionless, it carried intent. But even the same emotion could mean different things. Just like watching a film without subtitles, the meaning could be completely misinterpreted. Wait a second, visual imagery. Saul's mind wandered, and he suddenly thought of a more intuitive decoding method. He set aside the paper and pen, leaned in, and closely examined Nick's corpse. According to the records, Nick died after I left the Wizard Tower, but his body only arrived recently, not even 2 days ago. A lot of people might have come into contact with it. For example, Mentorkez, who handled the autopsy, his assistant, the people who transported the corpse, and even Kujin, who manages the storage room now. If during this time Nick's body, like the other corpses, retained some active state, could it also have a playback function like them? It had been some time, though, and Saul wasn't sure if the body could still recall what happened that long ago. But it was worth a try. With his mind made up, Saul turned his attention to the diary in his spiritual body. Good, old diary bro doesn't object. Without hesitation, Saul sat directly on the ground, ignoring the surprised looks from his souls, and began circulating his mental energy using his meditation diagram, moving counterclockwise. Soon he felt his body become weightless. When he looked down, he saw he'd already separated from his physical form. This out-of-body experience was even easier than usual. His modified body functioned like an intelligent system, helpfully guiding him out of itself. Saul raised his translucent hands to his face and confirmed that his soul form still looked like his past life. A thought flashed through his mind, and the transparent figure quickly shifted shape, once again taking on Saul's current appearance. He rose and floated above Nick's body, feeling a faint pull from below. Without resistance, he followed the force and entered the corpse. Boom! It felt like teleporting thousands of meters in an instant. The scene before him spun wildly. Dots became lines, lines twisted into abstract images. Everything lost its original shape. But Saul didn't panic. He focused hard, trying to discern something meaningful in the rapidly distorted visuals, something or someone familiar. Finally, his eyes settled on a certain spot. Something about it struck a chord of recognition. There was a sense of familiarity. That's a place I used to spend a lot of time in. Saul hadn't shared much of his life with Nick, either in life or death. That made the list of places that felt familiar all the more limited. Which meant this was a breakthrough. He focused his mind on that familiar scene. But the images continued to spin at high speed, making it extremely hard to identify anything specific from the blur of impressions. The distortion is because the scene is moving too fast relative to me. To see it clearly, I need to match its speed, become relatively still compared to it. It was like trying to make out the inside of a train car from a station platform, nearly impossible. But once inside the car, it became easy. Narrowing his eyes, Saul let his spiritual body vibrate again. His vision began to rotate rapidly, syncing with the spinning images. Because he was forcing his soul to accelerate, the strain was immense. If not for the diary acting as a locator to keep his mind clear, he wouldn't have been able to attempt this at all. Finally, Saul could make out the image before him. He saw a ceiling inscribed with runes, a workbench lined with tools at his side, and beneath him, a conveyor belt covered in black leather. What he was seeing didn't come solely from the corpse's eyes. It was the environmental feedback that Nick's body had absorbed, and that feedback was being transmitted to Saul's consciousness. Combined with his own familiarity with the place, the merged impressions formed a complete image. This was the third morgue. Chapter 314, Memories and Decryption. In the dim morgue, a series of tools, scalpel, tweezers, scissors, syringe, danced one after another across the cold corpse. By the time they returned to their original positions, the body was already in disarray, torn to shreds. From the skull to the ankles, every inch of skin had been meticulously sliced open, revealing either muscle tissue or cloudy, pus-like fluid beneath. Yet these viscous substances did not ooze out due to the ruptured skin. They remained still in place, like a motionless painting. And the one orchestrating all of this, Mentor Kaz, had kept his eyes closed the entire time. He merely moved his fingers slightly, and the tools flew and returned by themselves, like a bloody performance enacted by stringed puppets. When the autopsy was complete, Kaz clapped his hands lightly, shattering the frozen time that had settled over the body. Blood mixed with pus surged forth from bone and muscle, spilled from the laid-flat skin, and slowly dripped down the black leather table onto the morgue floor. "Kurum, come here," Kaz's voice rang out. A short-statured boy appeared above the corpse. Looking at the vivid red mess, he showed no discomfort. In fact, he even let out a fascinated, "Whoa." Fill in the brain tissue, clean up the blood and pus, reinfuse the embalming gel. Once you're done, call Hayden. Oh wait, he's not around. Call the person from next door to come patch up the wounds. I'll have someone come and move the body later. With that, Kaz finally opened his eyes, as if the one who had just dissected the corpse wasn't him, but a puppet under his command. His slightly clouded eyes reflected everything on the conveyor belt with clarity, yet not a single emotion flickered within them. He had been doing this kind of work for years, dissecting friends, students, enemies. He once thought that unless it was Gorsa himself lying on the belt, no death would ever shock him again. Having given his orders to the young apprentice, Kaz turned and left the morgue. As he departed, a few small objects in the room gently swayed, as if tugged by an invisible string. But soon, this unsettling movement ceased with the closing of the crimson door. Kuram respectfully watched Kaz leave, then rolled up his sleeves and began to clean up with visible excitement. The cleanup went smoothly. He began injecting the gel into Nick's remains, a substance that replaced blood and other bodily fluids, restoring the body's form. Then came a critical step, placing the brain back into Nick's split skull. However, when he pulled out a piece of artificial cranial bone from a box, he appeared noticeably tense. He tried to keep a straight face, but the tremble in his eyes betrayed his true emotions. He inserted the artificial bone, closed the skull, and stitched it up with simple sutures. The entire process was only slightly more sluggish than the earlier steps. Not long after, a stranger with a completely disinterested expression entered, cast a few healing spells on the reassembled corpse, then nodded listlessly at Kuram to indicate he was done, and left the morgue just as dispiritedly. Kuram, who had been observing from the side, suddenly let out a silent, relieved breath once the stranger was gone. The vision halted. Saul began struggling to break free from Nick's body. But the moment he exerted any force, the connection between him and Nick snapped. Ever since locking onto the locator, everything had changed. What used to be difficult movement, powerful enemies, terrifying mental interference, was now far more manageable. Once the veil obscuring the knowledge of wizardry was lifted by divine power, all that remained were principles and rules. Saul smoothly withdrew from Nick's corpse and returned to his own body. As he got up from the ground, he asked the Four Soul, "How did things go on your side?" Before entering Nick's body, he had intentionally prevented the diary from transmitting what he saw to the others. Instead, he'd let them analyze and discuss the mental signal in an isolated space. This time, the first to speak was Herman. "Herman, I couldn't decipher anything." Well, Saul thought, Herman had always been a man of action, not one for studying mental wave patterns and deep-level information. It was unfair to expect more from him. But the next updates weren't any better. Both Morden and Agu reported that the information was too brief to yield meaningful results. Saul didn't press further. The last member, N, was a newly formed composite consciousness with incomplete self-awareness. Saul wasn't expecting her to think anything. "I did manage to catch one lead on my end, but tracking down the true mastermind will still take a lot of work," Saul sighed. After all, Kuram was still only a first-rank apprentice. Judging by his demeanor, he'd been nervous but not afraid. Most likely, someone had bribed him into helping. Still, Saul could track down who had contacted Kuram. As long as he mentioned Master Gorsa's name, if Kuram hesitated even for a moment, Saul would admire the boy's courage. But regardless, the mastermind's caution was unnerving. Each phase of the plot involved 2 or 3 people, possibly more. Saul had once wondered if he was the actual target. But after all this chasing and probing, he could only chuckle bitterly. "I'm not worthy." Just then the last one Saul had any hope for, and suddenly spoke up. "And, Master Tilda, I think I deciphered what the mental wave meant." Agu, Morden, Herman. Each soul dropped a punctuation mark, perfectly expressing their astonishment. Even Saul hadn't expected N to succeed. Her tone wasn't very certain, but after witnessing the power of the Wraith Hand, Saul now took that uncertainty as a form of bragging. His eyes lit up with interest. "Let's hear it." And smash it, that's what it said. A simple message. Saul rubbed his chin, a habitual gesture whenever he was deep in thought. Herman, smash it, that's supposed to be a control command. Morden, no, actually. Now that she says it, it does seem to fit. Agu, yeah. It's hard to deduce the unknown, but once you're given the answer and work backwards, it's simple. Reverse calculating with this info, it checks out. And he tilde. Saul didn't bother running the math himself. He trusted Morden and Agu's experience and analytical ability. What puzzled him was how and had arrived at the answer. How did you do it? Faced with Saul's question, and hesitated a bit. And if I say the memory came to me on its own, would you believe me? She thought Saul would at least pause to consider it, but he raised an eyebrow and countered immediately. I do. Was it from the wraith hand or that fragmented? And instantly confessed. Chapter 315, Experimental Assistant. The fourth black page in the diary had originally been incomplete, but after adding the wraith hand and a small amount of Angela's soul energy, it had turned into a brand new page. The consciousness within had also transformed into a new personality. However, this new personality had yet to fully stabilize, most of the time, and remained silent. Saul knew she was working hard to stabilize her sense of self, so he didn't go out of his way to disturb her, for fear that the fusion would fail and she'd turn into a monstrous abomination. Now, that lack of fusion had begun to show its flaws. Anne's mind was frequently flooded with inexplicable memories, some with clear origins, others just scattered fragments. She often had to deliberately ignore those memories, or risk spiraling into distortion and madness. Fortunately, Anne resided within the diary. That alone allowed her to maintain a stable mental state at all times. Otherwise, the brutal combination of three fragmented consciousnesses would have inevitably ended in catastrophic conflict and self-destruction. The fragmentary wraith consciousness came from the Bloodthorn family's basement, Saul thought, and the diary also originated from there. That suggests the wraith's background is far from ordinary. I should try to get in to recall more in the future. There may be deeper secrets hidden in this diary. Still, Saul had no plans to question her right now. He simply made a mental note that Anne was familiar with the secret code of the soul-devouring flower, which hinted at past dealings with the land drifters. Ordinary friends wouldn't know such classified information. Saul smiled lightly, feeling a weight lift from his heart. Even though the insect within the wizard tower had yet to be found, simply knowing what kind of mental cues they had planted in him gave Saul a clear defensive advantage for the future. Sooner or later, he'd smoke the rat out. That's enough for now. I'll report what I found in the corpse and the data on the mental energy fluctuations to my master. As for how much he can uncover from it, we'll follow his lead. With all this evidence in hand, even someone as arrogant as Gorsa would surely tread more carefully. Saul had grown under Gorsa's subtle guidance and cultivation. Although the man's teaching style leaned heavily toward hands-off laissez-faire, Saul still felt grateful to him. If not for Gorsa, Saul probably wouldn't even have had the opportunity to work in the corpse room, let alone undergo the life-altering transformation of his wizard body. The wizard tower must not fall. If something happens here, every apprentice might get dragged into the conspiracy aimed at the master. Faces flashed through Saul's mind, familiar and dear, along with all the experiences he'd had over the years within the tower. Cold and ruthless as this place is, it gave me a foothold in this world. Saul walked over to his lab table, picked up the message pen, and sent a new note to his master Gorsa, despite having parted from him less than half a day ago. Because this matter involved an unknown mastermind, Saul didn't write anything specific, only that he hoped to meet with his master again. Such a message didn't come off as urgent. Saul prepared himself mentally for the possibility that it might be a while before he'd see Gorsa. What he didn't expect was that it would take half a month before he saw his new master again. Until then, Saul told no one about what he had discovered and simply continued his daily life as an apprentice. Only now, in addition to his work in the second storage room, he had taken on a lofty new research project. Who would have thought? A newly promoted third-rank apprentice participating in such a high-level experiment, resurrection. After a few days of contemplation, Saul quickly settled on his entry point for the research, something he was most familiar with, soul infusion. And the vessel for this infusion would be something else he knew well, the human body. For that, he specifically submitted a request to Mentor Rum for a second-rank apprentice proficient in soul infusion to assist him. Upon hearing Saul's idea, Mentor Rum agreed without hesitation. Best of all, Saul didn't have to pay a single coin for anything related to the Circular Laboratories experiments. The only problem was timing. The previous artificially created second-rank apprentices were either dead or tied up with other experiments. As for the newest artificial one, his soul had yet to fully synchronize with his body. In soul infusion experiments, if the soul and body are of different genders, the mismatch can help locate the soul more securely within the body, but it also leads to extreme cognitive dissonance. They had already conducted many experiments like this. A few times, the infusion had seemingly succeeded, only to fail at the last moment when the soul rejected the unfamiliar body and caused aberration. That's why, in later trials, Mentor Rum would deliberately select apprentices whose mental states had already deteriorated. They were already so messed up, a change in gender wasn't something they'd bother fussing over. But apprentices created under such conditions never lasted more than 3 years. Over time, both the soul and the body would begin rejecting each other. If forcibly kept together, the result would be soul collapse and bodily disintegration. Even so, among the many resurrection experiments, soul infusion remained the one with the highest success rate. Thus, when Saul came to Rum, he was offered abundant support. Rum even told Saul to come directly to him if any problem arose. And that was when Saul witnessed, for the first time, what it looked like when the mountain-sized Mentor Rum smiled. Friendly and terrifying. What stuck with Saul the most was that even Rum's rolls of fat seemed to be smiling. He made a quick and polite exit and returned to the second storage room to wait for the test subject, or rather, his assistant, to arrive. The days that followed slipped into an eerie calm. The mastermind behind the soul-devouring flower made no further moves, and Master Gorsa still hadn't shown up. The assistant Saul requested would apparently still take a few days to arrive. Work in the storage room remained pitifully scarce. Senior Byron stopped by once, seemingly to check on Saul's condition after advancing to third rank. He also shared his own experiences of studying after reaching third rank. Mostly because Byron owed Saul academic credits again. He had nothing else of value to offer at the moment. Saul, being the Tower Master's apprentice, was practically swimming in lab materials. Although some of Byron's insights didn't suit Saul's methods, they still served as useful references. Byron's knowledge was detailed, especially on aspects overlooked by most mentors, particularly the path toward becoming a true wizard. Currently, Saul's two masters, one absent and one overly cautious, had left him completely in the dark about how a third-rank apprentice might advance to true wizard. But Saul wasn't too anxious about learning that yet. He had just reached third rank and had only just mastered his first second-rank spell. Who knew how many years stood between him and advancement? Although his locator was already installed, his own magic power, mental strength, and knowledge base were all still lacking. Those were all things that could only be refined over time. And unlike before, He could no longer rely on wizard body modifications to quickly boost his stats. During the soul resin modification, he had already used materials that exceeded what a second-rank apprentice should have been allowed to access. Now that he was third rank, the available materials were essentially the same as before. In other words, Saul currently had no way to conduct a higher-grade wizard body modification than the one he'd already undergone. And equal-grade modifications weren't worth it. They hurt the body and burned through money. Chapter 316. The Wizard Tower is now in your hands. Byron told Saul, once you become a second-rank apprentice, you'll need to find your locator. Only by having a locator and recognizing how it interferes with your magic and mental power can you begin to merge with it. Only then can you learn second-rank spell. Learning a second-rank spell is the standard for becoming a third-rank wizard apprentice. The prerequisite for learning second-rank spell is to have initially merged with your locator. This fusion isn't as complete as Saul merging his diary into his soul body, but it's a recognition of the concept and will. Byron explained to Saul that he spent over a decade in the second rank because he couldn't fully accept his locator. He always felt that his locator didn't align with his path. It wasn't until Saul's first body transformation deeply moved him that Byron began thinking from a new perspective and finally accepted the relationship between himself and the locator. This breakthrough allowed the locator to stabilize. It was at that moment that he could control his skin freely and no longer needed to cut his throat to speak. But advancing to the third rank and becoming a true wizard is even harder. Besides the high requirements for magic and mental power, it requires merging your locator into your soul body. This is not a complete physical fusion, but the establishment of a stable soul connection. Only then can the locator protect you from contamination when you approach dangerous knowledge. I managed to accept my locator, but merging it with my soul body, I really have no clue, Byron said. Saul could tell that Byron's choice to forcefully merge the wraiths into his body, in an attempt to connect the locator to his soul body, was a reckless act of desperation after failing to find the right way. However, this path might not be impossible. How many people in this world can do what Saul did, relying on his diary to find the right road? As the famous saying goes, there were no roads in this world, but as more people walked, they became roads. Byron was now trying to blaze a trail through thorns. When stuck at second rank, everyone just hoped to advance a little further, ensuring they wouldn't lose their sanity after 30. But after reaching third rank, they still wanted to progress to true wizards. After all, once a true wizard, their lifespan could be extended in various ways. Humans are greedy like that, but that greed is also one of the driving forces behind progress. My locator is quite powerful among ordinary apprentices, but that makes it difficult to advance. Saul, I don't know what kind of locator you have, but I believe it's very special. So merging with it will likely be more challenging for you. Just like Kangsha, her talent made everyone think she would quickly advance to third rank and become a strong competitor for becoming the next true wizard. But her locator is too powerful and too unique, which means she may not be able to advance before 30. Byron's face showed a trace of sadness as he spoke, just like when he mentioned Nick's death. She'll be 29 soon. If she can't advance to third rank, that powerful and unique locator will turn into a danger for her, and it'll be more dangerous than the other failures. Saul could see Byron was feeling down and didn't know how to bring up that he had already completed the fusion and was now just waiting for things to naturally progress. Let's not talk about that. The locator is something that needs to be explored on your own. I can't help you with that. But regarding your choice of wizardry, magic enhancement, and mental power training, I've accumulated some experience. You can refer to it. Saul nodded eagerly, as that was exactly what he needed, these practical insights. The two of them discussed for the entire afternoon, and Saul took down a lot of notes. Byron, too, wasn't just the one offering knowledge. Some of Saul's creative ideas and feedback on his experiences were also beneficial to him. This was mainly because both of them specialized in the dark element and dealt with evil spirits and wraiths. Had it been anyone else, they might have misled each other. After this afternoon, Saul felt more grounded. He stopped anxiously waiting for his master's response and stopped overthinking who might be the land drifter's informant within the wizard tower. He began to focus more on his meditation and analyzing the new second-rank spell. Half a month later, Saul was once again brought into the dark room on the 21st floor by Gorsa, who appeared suddenly. "Sit down," Gorsa said as he took a seat in the corner of the room as usual. This time, Saul didn't hold back. Given that they had already established a clear master-apprentice relationship, it felt more appropriate to act more familiar. He sat down against the wall, but his posture wasn't as relaxed as before. Once Saul sat, he vaguely saw Gorsa extend his hand, and a light halo appeared at the tip of his finger. Gorsa gently pointed, and the halo left his finger, floating slowly to the ceiling of the small room. Saul instinctively looked up, and his eyes widened in shock. The ceiling of the room was completely covered with carved human faces. These faces lacked eyes and mouths, only having noses and ears. The faces were different from each other, some half hidden behind others, while others had stretched necks with protruding parts. Without eyes or mouths, Saul couldn't make out their expressions, but based on their distribution and movements, they looked like a group of people trapped at the bottom of a well, crowded together, all looking up at the sky, just like Saul was now looking up at them. "Those are people who were devoured by the wizard tower," Gorsa said, noticing that Saul was staring up. Saul forced himself to shift his gaze, focusing on his master instead. Gorsa continued to calmly look up at the ceiling. "I think you've guessed it by now. The wizard tower is alive." Saul was startled and quickly lowered his head, thinking, "No, I didn't guess that at all. It's a modified life form. It's one of the foundations of my family's renown and one of the cornerstones of our control over a side of the world. The inspiration for the modification came from rock giants. Of course, the materials used weren't rock giants. They're too fragile." Saul's mind was spinning. He had heard that Gorsa came from a powerful wizard family on another continent, but he didn't expect it to be this powerful. Enough about that. Did you find something new? Sorry, I haven't been in the best condition these past few days and couldn't meet you." "No, it's fine. Master, are you okay?" "I'm getting more and more unstable." Gorsa didn't dodge the topic and lowered his gaze from the ceiling, his voice still gentle as water. "I think I might not last much longer." Saul was shocked and almost jumped up. "Master." Gorsa raised his hand, and an invisible force pressed Saul back into his seat. "Don't worry. If nothing unexpected happens, I should be able to last another 10 years, Gorsa smiled. "Before that, I hope you can help me complete an experiment, when the time comes that I can no longer continue." He tapped on the wall. The wall echoed with a dull sound. "This wizard tower will be passed on to you." Chapter 317, Curiosity. Saul stood frozen in place, not daring to move. There was no surprise at falling into a windfall, only an oppressive feeling of dark clouds looming overhead, casting an eerie shadow. Before Saul could react a second time, he heard Gorsa's light laugh and saw his silver eyes narrow in a crescent shape. "No need to be so nervous. Perhaps you'll die before that day ever comes. In that case, I'd prefer inheriting your legacy, thank you." Saul didn't dare to voice his thoughts and could only lower his head even further. "Let's talk business. What did you find?" Saul took a deep breath and began to report. After returning to the second storage room, I placed the puppet on myself as per your instructions. But when I went to check on the corpse group, the puppet's eyes suddenly turned black. Is it the newly placed body that's problematic? Gorsa immediately guessed. Yes, I carefully examined Nick's body and discovered subtle mental fluctuations on him. If it weren't for the changes in the puppet you gave me, I might have mistaken it as some fluctuations from the necromantic formation inside the stone coffin. Gorsa leaned against the wall, showing no surprise. Interesting. While we were on guard against hidden enemies, the real problem turned out to be the corpses that appeared as per routine beside you. He looked down at his hand, noticing that one of his finger's pink bandages seemed a bit loose. Before Saul could notice it, it tightened again. If they are using the bodies to hint at you, the instructions must be very simple. I've noted the mental fluctuations. Master, do you think we could deduce any meaning from it? Saul handed over the notes he'd been carrying close to his body, but Gorsa merely glanced at them and returned them immediately. I've never worked with modified languages, and without understanding the foundational logic, reverse engineering could lead to many possibilities. It's of no value, Gorsa said. However, I can check those who have interacted with the bodies. You don't need to worry about it. Just focus on the new experiment. I heard you've applied for the soul infusion experiment's test subject. Yes, Saul hurriedly replied, but I only asked them to assist in recording specific reactions. However, Gorsa waved his hand dismissively. It's fine. The soul infusion experiment is about to be discontinued. It turns out, people who can't even reach the second rank by themselves will get no use from a second-rank body. Just treat them as normal expendables. I understand. The Tower Master was telling Saul not to care about the lives of the test subject during his experiments. After a moment of silence in the room, Saul thought he'd be sent away next. But unexpectedly, Gorsa sighed softly and began discussing another matter. Kaz should have already told you about the specific division of labor and progress for the experiment. I think it's time you knew the background of this experiment. Gorsa had considered telling Saul earlier, but his physical condition had been unstable at the time. The origin of the resurrection is that someone died. However, Yura's situation was different. She chose death voluntarily. Voluntary death. A reckless act. Saul's eyes widened as realization hit him. Is it the experiment about whether the soul can exist independently from the body? That's right, it was for that hypothesis. Gorsa's thoughts began drifting to the past. He had actively sought a marriage alliance with the Kema Duchy, aiming to find someone to help him manage the territories they had sent to him. He was a wizard, not a lord, and certainly not one of those who had lost hope of further advancement, only to numb themselves with secular power and pleasures. So who would want to personally govern a territory? Naturally, it was better to find a helper, and the best helper was the current administrator of the land. Thus, Yura had caught his attention due to her pursuit of knowledge, and in the end, he chose her. But after a few years of marriage, Yura's true nature revealed itself. Not only was she stubborn, but she was also daring enough to experiment with anything. Especially after Gorsa opened the material vault to her, some of her wild ideas began to materialize, and she began conducting increasingly crazy experiments. Wizards specializing in dark magic were always fascinated by corpses and souls, and thus most of Yura's experiments were centered around these things. Gorsa did not find this inappropriate. On the contrary, he felt this was the mark of a true wizard, and as a result, he admired Yura even more. Unfortunately, the story didn't evolve into a sweet romance. One day, Gorsa returned home to find his young wife with her head split in two, while her excited soul floated in the air. Can the soul exist independently of the body? They had discussed this question long ago, and at that time, Gorsa had dismissed Yura's hypothesis. He never expected that she would use herself as an experiment to prove her viewpoint right. Gorsa asked Yura why. If she could already stabilize her soul leaving the body, she still had to kill her physical body and sever all escape routes. Yura replied that, without fully detaching from her body, the experimental data would be inaccurate. At this point, Gorsa shook his head with a sigh. That was the day I truly realized how crazy my wife was. Saul, listening across from him, was left dumbfounded. For an unverified hypothesis, she had even been willing to sacrifice her life. After the soul left her body, the most important thing was, of course, to keep the soul pure, untouched by corruption. Gorsa continued, Yura was not unprepared. She had many temporary vessels, the standing corpses you saw in the storage room. Before she officially killed herself, she had possessed each of them to ensure there were no issues, thinking it would be flawless. However, things still went awry. Despite being cautious, avoiding any form of corruption, and occasionally resting in a body, Yura's soul still began to undergo mutation. The first symptoms were that Yura began to feel that she was no longer herself. Gorsa took over Yura's experiment, tirelessly working to purify her soul. Yet, the corruption kept coming back. Gorsa immediately halted the soul independence experiment. He began creating stable bodies for Yura. But this experiment was also unsuccessful, no matter how he created a body. Even one nearly identical to Yura's using her flesh, it couldn't permanently house her soul. After several failed possession experiments, something even worse began to happen. Yura gradually forgot her past memories and insisted that she was just a copy created by Gorsa. She even considered the scenes where Gorsa had handled the duplicate Yura as proof of Gorsa killing her. Creating a vessel that can permanently house Yura's soul is very difficult, Gorsa sighed. Since then, I gathered a group of wizards and recruited many apprentices, starting resurrection experiments focusing on soul purification and finding compatible bodies. But even after decades, we still haven't found a suitable vessel that can protect the soul from corruption like the original body. At this point, Gorsa suddenly lifted his head and fixed his intense gaze on Saul. So Saul, how did you manage it? Saul froze, his mind buzzing. Gorsa's body slowly leaned forward, and his silver eyes seemed almost ready to pop out from the bandages. How did you manage to take control of another's body and still stay alive without any signs of corruption or loss of control? I'm really very curious. Chapter 318, Agreement Reached. Gorsa laid his cards on the table. He finally revealed the real reason he had been watching Saul. But this revelation chilled Saul to the bone. For a moment, he recalled the rough texture of black leather on the conveyor belt in the morgue. He swallowed hard. His heartbeat, which had nearly stopped from the shock, gradually resumed. It might not be the worst outcome yet. If Master truly wanted to dissect me, there would have been no need to wait until now, let alone tell me outright at this moment. Saul tried hard to comfort himself, to calm down. In this world, soul separation and possession aren't rare occurrences. What makes me special is simply that I can ignore bodily rejection. If I put it out in the open, maybe I can even bring it to the table and study it together with my master. His mind spun rapidly, and in the shortest possible time, he had already decided on his response. I didn't do it on purpose. When I woke up, I was already in this body. Saul didn't deny it. Denying what had already been discovered would only make Gorsa look down on him. Better to admit something not too important, and do it in a frightened tone. I don't even know why I survived. I wasn't a wizard before, just an ordinary person. I didn't even know about wizards. I came from a small town. Gorsa waved his hand casually. Heh, no need to say all that. I don't care about your past. From the moment I first saw you, I confirmed that you weren't a wizard. Your mental aptitude may be strong, but it's like an unpolished gem, completely undeveloped. Since you weren't a wizard, even if you were a king in your original world, it makes no difference to me." He extended his index finger and gently tapped the spot between his brows. "I even suspect that the peculiarity of your soul doesn't stem from your original self. Instead, it came from the experience between leaving your original body and entering this one, which was also just an ordinary person's body. That transitional process may have altered you in a way that produced positive feedback, or we could call it a kind of beneficial alienation." Saul's mouth opened slightly. He had never considered this possibility. He had no memory of his death in his past life or his possession in this one, and he had never truly thought about why his mental aptitude was so high. In his previous world, transmigration and rebirth weren't novel concepts. They were frequently mentioned in countless novels. But most of those stories only used it as a hook to start the plot. No one ever explored the mechanisms behind it. As for the enhancement of his mental aptitude, Saul had simply attributed it to soul strengthening during the world crossing. But as for how it strengthened, he had never given it real thought. The matter was too distant for him. Without the power of a fourth-rank wizard or higher, how could he hope to unravel the mysteries of world hopping? But now, prompted by Gorsa's words, Saul suddenly realized he had fallen into the trap of being too close to see the truth. In a world filled with high-level powers, transmigration might not be so rare. The one thing that made him truly special was that he came from a world with completely different foundational laws. His old world was too different from the wizarding world. Going home might not be something that spatial travel alone could solve. Gorsa did not interrupt Saul's thoughts. He knew Saul had secrets, but for now, he was only concerned with the source of his soul's uniqueness. "I don't remember anything from that time." Saul strained to recall the transitional phase between his past and present lives, but nothing came to him. He didn't know how he died nor how he lived. One moment his eyes closed, and when they opened again, he was in this not-yet-cold body. Of course, since your original identity was neither wizard nor supernatural being, surviving in someone else's body might have just been a matter of chance. Your memory loss is likely a self-preservation mechanism of your consciousness." Gorsa chuckled and shook his head. "To study the special nature of your soul, we can still use many gentle experimental methods. But if we want to trace its origin, that part of history contains high-level knowledge. Your consciousness may not be able to withstand it." "You mean, studying what happened to me before I arrived in this body might harm me?" "Exactly. Whether you came from far away or another world, the reasons and experiences of your soul's traversal are knowledge you cannot bear. Even I would face tremendous danger trying to explore it." Gorsa narrowed his eyes. "But Saul, if I reach the point where I truly can't hold out any longer and the resurrection experiment still hasn't succeeded, I may have to risk exploring that dangerous knowledge." His meaning was clear. If he personally probed Saul's history, it could cause irreparable harm, even lethal corruption. So the choices were: either complete several resurrection experiments within 10 years, something that generations of mentors had failed to do, or uncover the secret of his soul's uniqueness and replicate it in Yura's soul, or become an experimental subject and endure others' perilous research. "I might not even have 10 years. Master won't wait until the last moment to start studying my transmigration. His research will take time. I may only have 5 years, maybe even 3. Though Gorsa hadn't said it outright, Saul knew. As a wizard, one must always maintain a sense of urgency and vigilance. Faced with such a future with no options left, Saul felt no resentment. The moment he chose to become a wizard, he had already understood that selection and elimination were the main themes of the Wizard Tower. At the very least, Gorsa had given him the chance to prove himself. "I understand, Master." Saul raised his head, eyes burning with awakened fighting spirit. I'll give it my all to assist you in completing the resurrection experiment. Gorsa's eyes curved again. Very good. I also promise during the course of the experiments I'll ensure all mentors fully support your work. If you complete the experiment or make significant contributions, I will protect your consciousness, not investigate your past and keep your secrets safe. This is a fair exchange, not that you have a choice. Saul laughed as well. No reward, master. Gorsa raised his hand again and knocked on the wall beside him. I already told you at the beginning, if you survive, this wizard tower will be yours. So that's what he meant. A wizard tower. Saul too reached out and stroked the rocky wall beside him. For someone like him, without any family or factional backing, it was truly tempting. Agreement reached. Even though his identity was already exposed, Saul was still curious. How exactly had Gorsa figured out he was a transmigrator? If another powerful second-rank wizard came along, would they also be able to tell that his soul wasn't the original one? He'd been in close contact with Kira before. Had she noticed? What about Kismet? Could he have known all along? If one day he ran into a completely unrelated second-rank wizard, would he be picked up and thrown straight onto a lab table? Master, when did you first realize that my soul didn't belong to this body? Can others tell as easily? The day you first appeared. Gorsa's tone remained gentle, but it sent a chill down Saul's spine. Like an early spring breeze, warm at first but still cold to the bone. The first day. At the time, I was on a night patrol and suddenly saw a boy with a large wound on his head, stumbling around the West Tower. That was you, Saul. You'd only just entered this body then, and your body and soul hadn't fully synchronized. Now and then I could see your soul leaking out from your body. Gorsa's voice carried a hint of amusement, as if he could still recall Saul's helpless and flustered state just after transmigrating. Chapter 319, The First Trial. Saul couldn't really remember the moment he had first crossed over into this world. When he had just arrived, he'd entered a completely unfamiliar body. On top of that, the body had a head injury, leaving him dazed and muddle-headed. That was why those little boys had ganged up on him, forcing him to shoulder the most dangerous task of guarding the dorms at night, all by himself. It turned out, back then, Mentor Gorsa had already discovered him. That master of his was really good at pretending. Saul's tense shoulders gradually relaxed. His soul form no longer flickered in and out, and even the faint rejection this body once had toward him had been completely suppressed through body refinement techniques. Using his own consciousness and mental energy, he had transformed his entire skin. Now, it looked completely like the new Saul. For the next few days, I followed you in secret, Gorsa continued. Your soul was fusing more and more smoothly with the new body. It had already surpassed the best results we'd ever achieved in resurrection experiments. If I hadn't caught you at the very beginning, I wouldn't have been able to tell you apart from a normal person. So I kept wondering, was it your body that was special, or was it your soul? Until that day, when you encountered that pool of blood on the 13th floor. Of course Saul remembered. That night had changed his life, the night that awakened the dead wizard's diary. To escape the death that pool of blood heralded, Saul had knocked on Kangsha's door across the hall. Your instinct was startling, Gorsa swayed slightly as he spoke. Though your soul was unfamiliar, it didn't seem especially powerful. Only your mental energy was a bit higher than average, but even that was within the range of an ordinary prodigy. So how did you know that pool of blood was deadly? I don't know. Saul deliberately blanked his mind and replied in a daze. It was like a voice inside me just kept shouting, "Don't touch it or you'll die." But I also understood that if I left that blood there, I'd be the one dealt with the next morning. What Saul said wasn't false. The voice had indeed come from within him, specifically from the diary on his left shoulder. Gorsa didn't doubt him. In fact, he nodded in agreement. From that day forward, I realized the special part of you isn't the body you merged with. It's your soul. Perhaps the dimensional leap you went through left your soul with a unique adaptive property, allowing you to resist the body's rejection and avoid mental contamination due to cognitive dissonance. Everything you did afterward only confirmed that. The greatest issue you faced was the occasional out-of-body episode as your soul grew stronger, and even that you managed to fix through body refinement. Gorsa's swaying body suddenly went still. He leaned forward slightly and looked Saul in the eyes. Saul, though you've been researching vessels, that's only the foundation. Sooner or later, your path will lead to the soul. Yes, master, I already understand my task. Gorsa's voice gradually grew soft. My time is running out, which means your time is also running out. 5 years. I hope you'll have an answer by then. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to take matters into my own hands. Most soul-based wizard experiments were irreversibly damaging to soul bodies. Faced with such risky experimentation and only one high-level expendable to work with, Gorsa preferred to wait a bit longer. He would wait for Saul to grow, wait for his soul form to become stronger, wait for him to unravel this mystery himself. This too is a kind of experiment, Gorsa thought to himself. It was like planting a weak little seed in a petri dish. Maybe it would wither midway, maybe it would grow into a bloodthirsty vine, or maybe it would grow into an ordinary little sprout. But that didn't matter. He still had some time left. He wanted to see what kind of fruit this rare seed would ultimately bear. 5 years, huh? Saul understood. That was Gorsa's absolute limit. No problem. If I don't complete my task in 5 years, I'll lie down on the experiment table myself. Since there was no other choice, he might as well bet everything on this. Very good. Gorsa's silver eyes curved into a smile. One final piece of advice. When it comes to souls, the wizarding world has already made very deep inroads. But even so, there are vast domains that remain unknown. If you want to study the soul, you can't stay in the safety zone. A true wizard is always treading the path of the unknown. Saul silently savored those words. Was Master Gorsa encouraging him to take risks? Did he think Saul had been playing it too safe lately? Indeed, ever since acquiring the diary, Saul's actions might seem risky on the surface, but in truth, he'd always remained inside his comfort zone. And because of that, he understood many things only on a superficial level, knowing that something worked, but not why it worked. He was beginning to lack that most vital quality for any wizard, the spirit of exploration. If he kept relying on the diary, he could indeed cruise through the early stages of becoming a wizard. But that was like building a 100-story skyscraper with no foundation. Eventually, at the very end of the road, he would face a life-or-death crisis, one he could neither avoid nor escape. It would be like floating high in the sky in a hot air balloon without knowing any flight spells. Once the balloon's energy ran out, the only outcome waiting for him would be a fatal crash. The thought sent a chill through Saul's spine. Cold sweat beaded all over his body. He was more terrified than he had been when Gorsa had exposed his identity as a transmigrator. I can't let myself use the diary's power for research or study anymore. If I grow dependent, I'll lose the habit of learning on my own. I'll become a puppet of the diary, a failure of a wizard who doesn't dare try a new spell without it. When Gorsa spoke those words to him, he probably meant them as a casual piece of advice. But by sheer accident, they helped Saul unearth the greatest hidden crisis he was currently facing. Gorsa was very satisfied with Saul's shaken reaction. He could tell that Saul had experienced an epiphany. Sometimes, vague philosophical truths, when matched with one's personal experience, could transform into specific warning signs, thus becoming lessons with far greater impact than others could ever appreciate. Of course, the prerequisite was thinking it through. "We've talked enough for today," Gorsa said. "As for the experiment, think it over after you go back. If you have no other questions, I'll send you back to the second storeroom now." Saul snapped out of his deep thoughts. Hearing the implicit dismissal, he was about to nod when a question suddenly came to mind. "Master, back then, that pool of—" Ahem. "No, it's nothing." Saul's heart skipped a beat and he gave up the question. "Please send me back." Gorsa smiled slightly. The halo above their heads abruptly vanished, plunging the surroundings back into darkness. A wave of dizziness hit Saul. His mind felt like it was plunging downward. Once more, he fell through a world filled with eyes, until he landed on the single bed in the storeroom. He didn't get up, just lay there in the same posture, staring blankly at the ceiling. Kangsha once told me the dorm across from hers was unoccupied. Then that night, that pool of blood, who put it there? Recalling the calm look in Gorsa's eyes at the end, Saul finally chose to let it go. So the trial began all the way back then, huh? Chapter 320, Test Subject 147. Ever since Saul revealed his identity, it seemed Gorsa had elevated his status yet again. During a routine warehouse inventory check, Saul discovered that the rules on the very first page of the warehouse manual had changed. The first rule remained the same: the number of burning candles must stay above 88. But the second rule, which used to state, "Do not tamper with numbered items at will," had been changed to, "Do not remove numbered items from the warehouse without permission." In other words, Gorsa had granted Saul full access to the entire warehouse. That included the corpse cluster that had once been the vessel for Lady Yura. It was also on this day that the soul infusion test subject Saul had requested for so long finally arrived. After discovering the change in the warehouse manual, Saul didn't rush to make use of it. These items had been prohibited not just because of their rarity, but also due to their inherent danger. Saul now went through all the materials in the second warehouse again, reevaluating them. He wanted to pick out the ones that could be used in upcoming experiments. The experiment he wanted to complete wasn't limited to the resurrection project assigned by his master. Saul also had no intention of giving up on enhancing his own abilities. What could currently provide him with the greatest offensive strength was combining the second-rank spell Touch of Torment with the tentacles formed through his soul-body transformation, creating a soul-targeting attack spell, Soul Fishing. Aside from that, development of the mental realm also needed to continue, though it wasn't quite as urgent. Walking along the warehouse shelves, Saul looked up and saw the elven whispers he had once used for Kangsha. The original 2 leaves of this item had already fallen off, leaving only a bare twig. Gorsa had thus given elven whispers to Saul directly. However, Saul hadn't used the odd item, capable of affecting one's perception of time, since then. This thing can influence consciousness. Could it also serve as a kind of soul anesthetic? Saul jotted the idea down, though it might already be dead. He had just finished recording one item when he suddenly felt a magical fluctuation behind him. Quickly turning around, he spotted a giant quill floating in the air through a gap between the shelves. Swish, swish, swish. It was the communication quill that had been silent for several days. Saul swiftly closed his notebook and hurried toward it. By the time he reached the desk, the quill had already finished writing and flown away on its own. The parchment contained only one line: "The assistant has been delivered to the bronze gate. Please retrieve accordingly." Saul let out a sigh, finally here. He set aside his current work and briskly made his way down 2 corridors, arriving at the bronze gate. As he pushed open the left door, a beautiful and cold face appeared before him. Blonde hair and blue eyes, with a curvaceous figure wrapped in a black apprentice's robe, which on her looked like a dress fit for the red carpet. Olive Mentor Rum's soul infusion test subject seemed to come from the same mold. Several seconds after Saul opened the door, the blonde second-rank female apprentice finally turned her head stiffly to look at him, her expression blank. "Hello, I'm number 147, here to assist with your experiment." Saul stepped aside to let her in, observing her slightly rigid movements. "I've always been curious," he said. "There aren't many blondes in the tower, so why are all of Mentor Rum's test subjects blonde and blue-eyed?" Following half a step behind him, 147 replied in a flat tone, "Our bodies were modified by Mentor Rum into a unified appearance for easier identification, and to avoid complications should we encounter relatives of our original bodies." Saul nodded at that. "Makes sense." He looked at the woman walking beside him. She appeared to be in her early 20s. With the cosmetic powers of magic, eye and hair color were easy to alter. If someone told him this body used to belong to an elderly woman, Saul would believe it. Though 147 was undeniably beautiful, Saul felt nothing for her. After spending so long in the corpse room and warehouse, everyone just looked like materials. Not to mention the fact that a man's soul was sealed inside this beautiful body. With that in mind, all traces of romantic thought vanished. Back in the second warehouse, the sight of an entire row of corpses startled 147. But because her soul and body were out of sync, even if she could barely move, she couldn't perform subtle actions, like widening her eyes or raising her eyebrows. So her shock was expressed by opening her mouth completely blankly, so wide it could almost fit a fist. "These are all corpses." Though surprised, 147's voice still carried no emotion. "Yes, anyone you recognize." During her surprise, 147 had been staring at one particular corpse. Seemed she did recognize someone. That corpse had been here since before Saul entered the wizard tower. For 147 to recognize someone that old, a third-rank apprentice, meant she was likely one of those first-rank apprentices who had been stuck in the tower for over a decade without advancing. Most willing to undergo soul infusion experiments were exactly such people, long unable to advance, hopeless, but unwilling to give up. Your soul and body aren't in sync. Right now, your soul is forcibly sealed into your body using a magic array. So when you're here, stay away from these corpses. Understood. The two walked past the corpse cluster and rows of shelves. 147 didn't dare look around much and just kept her head down, following Saul closely. Eventually, they reached the experiment table at the end of the warehouse. This space had been specially cleared, with a test bed specially requested just for 147. From now on, come here at 3 p.m. every day. Experiments will usually go until 7. I'll try not to delay your return to the dorms. Oh, and what element do you specialize in? Officially, Saul had requested an assistant. If her specialty was also dark element, she could help out in some of the experiments. Dark element. After a few seconds, 147 replied slowly, a beat too late. Saul raised one eyebrow. Not just my imagination, this 147 really is slow to react. I've worked with other soul-infused test subjects before. Though they were dull and expressionless, they weren't this sluggish. Did I get a defective one? Should I ask Mentor Rum for a replacement? With someone this slow, dangerous experiments could be compromised due to untimely feedback. Like, say, 147's life. Saul glanced up at the woman in front of him, who was once again zoning out, maybe. He decided to just speak plainly. My experiments differ from other soul infusion tests. Others may just test various soul reactions and changes under different conditions. I focus more on the body's physical data during soul-body interaction. If you can't provide accurate cooperation and timely feedback, it's best you withdraw from this dangerous project. But the moment Saul finished speaking, 147 suddenly dropped to her knees with a loud thud. This time, her movement was much smoother. She placed her hands on the ground before her, bowed low, and pressed her forehead against the back of her hand. "Sir," her voice carried a desperate determination, "I've come to follow you." Saul blinked in surprise, then sucked in a sharp breath. "Who are you?" I'm Hayden." After a moment's hesitation, 147 admitted it like someone breaking a plate, resigned to their fate. "Solved.